Chapter 72 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 72. Mr. Furnival's Speech. All this, as may be supposed, disturbed Felix Graham not a little. He perceived that each of those two witnesses had made a great effort to speak the truth, an honest, painful effort to speak the truth, and in no way to go beyond it. His gall had risen within him while he had listened to Mr. Furnival, and witnessed his success in destroying the presence of mind of that weak wretch who was endeavouring to do his best in the cause of justice. And again, when Mr. Chaffanbrass had seized hold of that poor dram, and used all his wit in deducing from it a self-condemnation from the woman before him, when the practised barrister had striven to show that she was an habitual drunkard, dishonest, unchaste, evil in all her habits, Graham had felt almost tempted to get up and take her part. No doubt he had evinced this, for Chaffanbrass had understood what was going on in his colleague's mind, and had looked round at him from time to time with an air of scorn that had been almost unendurable. And then it had become the duty of the prosecutors to prove the circumstances of the former trial. This was of course essentially necessary, seeing that the offence for which Lady Mason was now on her defence was perjury alleged to have been committed at that trial. And when this had been done at considerable length by Sir Richard Leatherham, not without many interruptions from Mr. Furnival and much assistance from Mr. Steelyard, it fell upon Felix Graham to show by cross-examination of Crook the attorney what had been the nature and effect of Lady Mason's testimony. As he arose to do this, Mr. Chaffanbrass whispered into his ear, "If you feel yourself unequal to it, I'll take it up. I won't have her thrown over for any etiquette, nor yet for any squeamishness." To this Graham vouchsafed no answer. He would not even reply by a look. But he got up and did his work. At this point his conscience did not interfere with him, for the questions which he asked referred to facts which had really occurred. Lady Mason's testimony at that trial had been believed by everybody. The gentleman who had cross-examined her on the part of Joseph Mason, and who was now dead, had failed to shake her evidence. The judge who tried the case had declared to the jury that it was impossible to disbelieve her evidence. That judge was still living, a poor old bedridden man, and in the course of this latter trial his statement was given in evidence. There could be no doubt that at the time Lady Mason's testimony was taken as worthy of all credit. She had sworn that she had seen the three witnesses sign the codicil, and no one had then thrown discredit on her. The upshot of all was this, that the prosecuting side proved satisfactorily that such and such things had been sworn by Lady Mason, and Felix Graham on the side of the defence proved that when she had so sworn, her word had been considered worthy of credence by the judge and by the jury, and had hardly been doubted even by the counsel opposed to her. All this really had been so, and Felix Graham used his utmost ingenuity in making clear to the court how high and unassailed had been the position which his client then held. All this occupied the court till nearly 4 o'clock, and then as the case was over on the part of the prosecution, the question arose whether or no Mr. Furnival should address the jury on that evening, or wait till the following day. "If your lordship will sit till 7 o'clock," said Mr. Furnival, "I think I can undertake to finish what remarks I shall have to make by that time." "I should not mind sitting till 9 for the pleasure of hearing Mr. Furnival," said the judge, who was very anxious to escape from Alston on the day but one following. And thus it was decided that Mr. Furnival should commence his speech. I have said that in spite of some previous hesitation, his old fire had returned to him when he began his work in court on behalf of his client. If this had been so when that work consisted in the cross-examination of a witness, it was much more so with him now when he had to exhibit his own powers of forensic eloquence. When a man knows that he can speak with ease and energy, and that he will be listened to with attentive ears, it is all but impossible that he should fail to be enthusiastic, even though his cause be a bad one. It was so with him now. All his old fire came back upon him, and before he had done he had almost brought himself again to believe Lady Mason to be that victim of persecution as which he did not hesitate to represent her to the jury. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said, "I never rose to plead a client's cause with more confidence than I now feel in pleading that of my friend Lady Mason. 20 years ago I was engaged in defending her rights in this matter, and I then succeeded. I little thought at that time that I should be called on after so long an interval to renew my work. I little thought that the pertinacity of her opponent would hold out for such a period. I compliment him on the firmness of his character, on that equable temperament which has enabled him to sit through all this trial, and to look without dismay on the unfortunate lady whom he has considered it to be his duty to accuse of perjury. I did not think that I should live to fight this battle again. But so it is, and as I had but little doubt of victory then, so have I none now. Gentlemen of the jury, I must occupy some of your time, and of the time of the court, in going through the evidence which has been adduced by my learned friend against my client. But I almost feel that I shall be detaining you unnecessarily, so sure I am that the circumstances, as they have been already explained to you, could not justify you in giving a verdict against her." As Mr. Furnival's speech occupied fully 3 hours, I will not trouble my readers with the whole of it. He began by describing the former trial, and giving his own recollections as to Lady Mason's conduct on that occasion. In doing this he fully acknowledged on her behalf that she did give as evidence that special statement which her opponents now endeavoured to prove to have been false. "If it were the case," he said, "that that codicil, or that pretended codicil, was not executed by old Sir Joseph Mason, and was not witnessed by Usbech, Kenneby, and Bridget Bolster, then in that case Lady Mason has been guilty of perjury." Mr. Furnival, as he made this acknowledgment, studiously avoided the face of Lady Mason; but as he made this assertion almost everybody in the court, except her own counsel, did look at her. Joseph Mason opposite, and Dockwrath, fixed their gaze closely upon her. Sir Richard Leatherham and Mr. Steelyard turned their eyes towards her, probably without meaning to do so. The judge looked over his spectacles at her. Even Mr. Aram glanced round at her surreptitiously, and Lucius turned his face upon his mother's almost with an air of triumph. But she bore it all without flinching, though the state of her mind at that moment must have been pitiable. And Mrs. Orme, who held her hand all the while, knew that it was so. The hand which rested in hers was twitched, as it were, convulsively, but the culprit gave no outward sign of her guilt. Mr. Furnival then read much of the evidence given at the former trial, and especially showed how the witnesses had then failed to prove that Usbech had not been required to write his name. It was quite true, he said, that they had been equally unable to prove that he had done so, but that amounted to nothing. The onus probandi lay with the accusing side. There was the signature, and it was for them to prove that it was not that which it pretended to be. Lady Mason had proved that it was so, and because that had then been held to be sufficient, they now, after 20 years, took this means of invalidating her testimony. From that he went to the evidence given at the present trial, beginning with the malice and interested motives of Dockwrath. Against 3 of them only was it needful that he should allege anything, seeing that the statements made by the others were in no way injurious to Lady Mason, if the statements made by those 3 were not credible. Torrington, for instance, had proved that other deed, but what of that, if on the fatal 14th of July Sir Joseph Mason had executed 2 deeds? As to Dockwrath, That his conduct had been interested and malicious there could be no doubt, and he submitted to the jury that he had shown himself to be a man unworthy of credit. As to Kenneby, that poor weak creature, as Mr. Furnival in his mercy called him, he, Mr. Furnival, could not charge his conscience with saying that he believed him to have been guilty of any falsehood. On the contrary, he conceived that Kenneby had endeavoured to tell the truth. But he was one of those men whose minds were so inconsequential that they literally did not know truth from falsehood. He had not intended to lie when he told the jury that he was not quite sure he had never witnessed 2 signatures by Sir Joseph Mason on the same day, nor did he lie when he told them again that he had witnessed 3. He had meant to declare the truth, but he was unfortunately a man whose evidence could not be of much service in any case of importance, and could be of no service whatever in a criminal charge tried, as was done in this instance, more than 20 years after the alleged commission of the offence. With regard to Bridget Bolster, he had no hesitation whatever in telling the jury that she was a woman unworthy of belief, unworthy of that credit which the jury must place in her before they could convict any one on her unaided testimony. It must have been clear to them all that she had come into court drilled and instructed to make one point-blank statement, and to stick to that. She had refused to give any evidence as to her own signature. She would not even look at her own name as written by herself, but had contented herself with repeating over and over again those few words which she had been instructed so to say. The statement, namely, that she had never put her hand to more than one deed. Then he addressed himself, as he concluded his speech, to that part of the subject which was more closely personal to Lady Mason herself. "And now, gentlemen of the jury," he said, "before I can dismiss you from your weary day's work, I must ask you to regard the position of the lady who has been thus accused, and the amount of probability of her guilt which you may assume from the nature of her life. I shall call no witnesses as to her character, for I will not submit her friends to the annoyance of those questions which the gentlemen opposite might feel it their duty to put to them. Circumstances have occurred, so much I will tell you, and so much no doubt you all personally know, though it is not in evidence before you. Circumstances have occurred which would make it cruel on my part to place her old friend Sir Peregrine Orme in that box. The story, could I tell it to you, is one full of romance, but full also of truth and affection. But though Sir Peregrine Orme is not here, there sits his daughter by Lady Mason's side. There she has sat through this tedious trial, giving comfort to the woman that she loves, and there she will sit till your verdict shall have made her further presence here unnecessary. His lordship and my learned friend there will tell you that you cannot take that as evidence of character. They will be justified in so telling you. But I, on the other hand, defy you not to take it as such evidence. Let us make what laws we will, they cannot take precedence of human nature. There too sits my client's son. You will remember that at the beginning of this trial the Solicitor General expressed a wish that he were not here. I do not know whether you then responded to that wish, but I believe I may take it for granted that you do not do so now. Had any woman dear to either of you been so placed through the malice of an enemy, would you have hesitated to sit by her in her hour of trial? Had you doubted of her innocence, you might have hesitated, for who could endure to hear announced in a crowded court like this the guilt of a mother or a wife? But he has no doubt, nor, I believe, has any living being in this court, unless it be her kinsman opposite, whose life for the last 20 years has been made wretched by a wicked longing after the patrimony of his brother. Gentlemen of the jury, there sits my client with as loving a friend on one side as ever woman had, and with her only child on the other. during the incidents of this trial, the nature of the life she has led during the last 20 years, since the period of that terrible crime with which she is charged, has been proved before you. I may fearlessly ask you whether so fair a life is compatible with the idea of guilt so foul. I have known her intimately during all those years, not as a lawyer, but as a friend, and I confess that the audacity of this man Dockwrath in assailing such a character with such an accusation strikes me almost with admiration. What! Forgery? For that, gentlemen of the jury, is the crime with which she is substantially charged. Look at her as she sits there. That she, at the age of 20, or not much more, she who had so well performed the duties of her young life that she should have forged a will, have traced one signature after another in such a manner as to have deceived all those lawyers who were on her track immediately after her husband's death. For mark you, if this be true, with her own hand she must have done it. There was no accomplice there. Look at her. Was she a forger? Was she a woman to deceive the sharp bloodhounds of the law? Could she, with that young baby on her bosom, have wrested from such as him? And as he spoke he pointed with his finger, but with a look of unutterable scorn, to Joseph Mason, who was sitting opposite to him. That fragment of his old father's property which he coveted so sorely. Where had she learned such skilled artifice? Gentlemen, such ingenuity in crime as that has never yet been proved in a court of law, even against those who have spent a life of wretchedness in acquiring such skill. And now you are asked to believe that such a deed was done by a young wife, of whom all that you know is that her conduct in every other respect has been beyond all praise. Gentlemen, I might have defied you to believe this accusation had it even been supported by testimony of a high character. Even in such case you would have felt that there was more behind than had been brought to your knowledge. But now, having seen, as you have, of what nature are the witnesses on whose testimony she has been impeached, it is impossible that you should believe this story. Had Lady Mason been a woman steeped in guilt from her infancy, had she been noted for cunning and fraudulent ingenuity, had she been known as an expert forger, you would not have convicted her on this indictment, having had before you the malice and greed of Dockwrath, the stupidity, I may almost call it idiocy, of Kenneby, and the dogged resolution to conceal the truth evinced by the woman Bolster. With strong evidence you could not have believed such a charge against so excellent a lady. With such evidence as you have had before you, you could not have believed the charge against a previously convicted felon. And what has been the object of this terrible persecution, of the dreadful punishment which has been inflicted on this poor lady? For remember, though you cannot pronounce her guilty, her sufferings have been terribly severe. Think what it must have been for a woman with habits such as hers to have looked forward for long, long weeks to such a martyrdom as this. Think what she must have suffered in being dragged here and subjected to the gaze of all the county as a suspected felon. Think what must have been her feelings when I told her, not knowing how deep an ingenuity might be practised against her, that I must counsel her to call to her aid the unequalled talents of my friend Mr. Chaffanbrass. Unequal no longer, but far surpassed, whispered Chaffanbrass in a voice that was audible through all the centre of the court. Her punishment has been terrible, continued Mr. Furnival. After what she has gone through, it may well be doubted whether she can continue to reside at that sweet spot which has aroused such a feeling of avarice in the bosom of her kinsman. You have heard that Sir Joseph Mason had promised his eldest son that Orley Farm should form a part of his inheritance. It may be that the old man did make such a promise. If so, he thought fit to break it. But is it not wonderful that a man wealthy as is Mr. Mason, for his fortune is large, who has never wanted anything that money can buy, a man for whom his father did so much, that he should be stirred up by disappointed avarice to carry in his bosom for 20 years so bitter a feeling of rancour against those who are nearest to him by blood and ties of family. Gentlemen, it has been a fearful lesson, but it is one which neither you nor I will ever forget. And now I shall leave my client's case in your hands. As to the verdict which you will give, I have no apprehension. You know as well as I do that she has not been guilty of this terrible crime. That you will so pronounce, I do not for a moment doubt. But I do hope that that verdict will be accompanied by some expression on your part, which may show to the world at large how great has been the wickedness displayed in the accusation. And yet, as he sat down, he knew that she had been guilty. To his ear her guilt had never been confessed, but yet he knew that it was so, and knowing that, he had been able to speak as though her innocence were a thing of course. That those witnesses had spoken truth he also knew, and yet he had been able to hold them up to the execration of all around them as though they had committed the worst of crimes from the foulest of motives. And more than this, stranger than this, worse than this, when the legal world knew, as the legal world soon did know, that all this had been so, the legal world found no fault with Mr. Furnival, conceiving that he had done his duty by his client in a manner becoming an English barrister and an English gentleman. End of chapter 72 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 73 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 73. Mrs. Orme tells the story. It was late when that second day's work was over, and when Mrs. Orme and Lady Mason again found themselves in the Hamworth carriage. They had sat in court from 10 in the morning till past 7, with a short interval of a few minutes in the middle of the day, and were weary to the very soul when they left it. Lucius again led out his mother, and as he did so he expressed to her in strong language his approval of Mr. Furnival's speech. At last some one had spoken out on his mother's behalf in that tone which should have been used from the first. He had been very angry with Mr. Furnival, thinking that the barrister had lost sight of his mother's honour, and that he was playing with her happiness. But now he was inclined to forgive him. Now at last the truth had been spoken in eloquent words, and the persecutors of his mother had been addressed in language such as it was fitting that they should hear. To him the last 2 hours had been 2 hours of triumph, and as he passed through the hall of the court, he whispered in his mother's ear that now at last, as he hoped, her troubles were at an end. And another whisper had been spoken as they passed through that hall. Mrs. Orme went out leaning on the arm of her son, but on the other side of her was Mr. Aram. He had remained in his seat till they had begun to move, and then he followed them. Mrs. Orme was already half-way across the court, when he made his way up to her side, and very gently touched her arm. "Sir," said she, looking round. "Do not let her be too sure," he said. "Do not let her be over-confident. All that may go for nothing with a jury." Then he lifted his hat and left her. All that go for nothing with a jury? She hardly understood this, but yet she felt that it all should go for nothing if right were done. Her mind was not argumentative, nor yet perhaps was her sense of true justice very acute. When Sir Peregrine had once hinted that it would be well that the criminal should be pronounced guilty because in truth she had been guilty, Mrs. Orme by no means agreed with him. But now, having heard how those wretched witnesses had been denounced, knowing how true had been the words they had spoken, knowing how false were those assurances of innocence with which Mr. Furnival had been so fluent, she felt something of that spirit which had actuated Sir Peregrine, and had almost thought that justice demanded a verdict against her friend. "Do not let her be over confident," Mr. Aram had said. But in truth Mrs. Orme, as she had listened to Mr. Furnival's speech, had become almost confident that Lady Mason would be acquitted. It had seemed to her impossible that any jury should pronounce her to be guilty after that speech. The state of her mind as she listened to it had been very painful. Lady Mason's hand had rested in her own during a great portion of it, and it would have been natural that she should give some encouragement to her companion by a touch, by a slight pressure, as the warm words of praise fell from the lawyer's mouth. But how could she do so, knowing that the praise was false? It was not possible to her to show her friendship by congratulating her friend on the success of a lie. Lady Mason also had no doubt felt this, for after a while her hand had been withdrawn, and they had both listened in silence, giving no signs to each other as to their feelings on the subject. But as they sat together in the carriage, Lucius did give vent to his feelings. "I cannot understand why all that should not have been said before, and said in a manner to have been as convincing as it was to day." "I suppose there was no opportunity before the trial," said Mrs. Orme, feeling that she must say something, but feeling also how impossible it was to speak on the subject with any truth in the presence both of Lady Mason and her son. "But an occasion should have been made," said Lucius. "It is monstrous that my mother should have been subjected to this accusation for months, and that no one till now should have spoken out to show how impossible it is that she should have been guilty." "Ah, Lucius, you do not understand," said his mother. "And I hope I never may," said he. "Why did not the jury get up in their seats at once and pronounce their verdict when Mr. Furnival's speech was over? Why should they wait there, giving another day of prolonged trouble, knowing as they must do what their verdict will be? To me this is all incomprehensible, seeing that no good can in any way come from it." And so he went on, striving to urge his companions to speak upon a subject which to them did not admit of speech in his presence. It was very painful to them, for in addressing Mrs. Orme he almost demanded from her some expression of triumph. "You at least have believed in her innocence," he said at last, "and have not been ashamed to show that you did so." "Lucius," said his mother, "we are very weary. Do not speak to us now. Let us rest till we are at home." Then they closed their eyes, and there was silence till the carriage drove up to the door of Orley Farm house. The two ladies immediately went upstairs, but Lucius, with more cheerfulness about him than he had shown for months past, remained below to give orders for their supper. It had been a joy to him to hear Joseph Mason and Dockwrath exposed, and to listen to those words which had so clearly told the story as to his mother's history. All that torrent of indignant eloquence had been to him an enumeration of the simple facts, of the facts as he knew them to be, of the facts as they would now be made plain to all the world. At last the day had come when the cloud would be blown away. He, looking down from the height of his superior intellect on the folly of those below him, had been indignant at the great delay, but that he would now forgive. They had not been long in the house, perhaps about 15 minutes, when Mrs. Orme returned downstairs, and gently entered the dining room. He was still there, standing with his back to the fire, and thinking over the work of the day. "Your mother will not come down this evening, Mr. Mason." "Not come down?" "No, she is very tired indeed. I fear you hardly know how much she has gone through." "Shall I go to her?" said Lucius. "No, Mr. Mason, do not do that. I will return to her now, but in a few minutes, Mr. Mason, I will come back to you again, for I shall have something to say to you." You will have tea here?" "I don't know. I think not. When I have spoken to you I will go back to your mother. I came down now in order that you might not wait for us." And then she left the room and again went up stairs. It annoyed him that his mother should thus keep away from him, but still he did not think that there was any special reason for it. Mrs. Orme's manner had been strange, but then everything around them in these days was strange, and it did not occur to him that Mrs. Orme would have aught to say in her promised interview which would bring to him any new cause for sorrow. Lady Mason, when Mrs. Orme returned to her, was sitting exactly in the position in which she had been left. Her bonnet was off and was lying by her side, and she was seated in a large arm-chair, again holding both her hands to the sides of her head. No attempt had been made to smooth her hair, or to remove the dust and soil which had come from the day's long sitting in the court. She was a woman very careful in her toilet, and scrupulously nice in all that touched her person. But now all that had been neglected, and her whole appearance was haggard and dishevelled. "You have not told him?" she said. "No, I have not told him yet, but I have bidden him expect me. He knows that I am coming to him." "And how did he look?" "I did not see his face." And then there was silence between them for a few minutes, during which Mrs. Orme stood at the back of Lady Mason's chair, with her hand on Lady Mason's shoulder. "Shall I go now, dear?" said Mrs. Orme. "No, stay a moment. Not yet." "Oh, Mrs. Orme!" "You will find that you will be stronger and better able to bear it when it has been done." "Stronger? Why should I wish to be stronger? How will he bear it?" "It will be a blow to him, of course." "It will strike him to the ground, Mrs. Orme. I shall have murdered him. I do not think that he will live when he knows that he is so disgraced." "He is a man, and will bear it as a man should do. Shall I do anything for you before I go?" "Stay a moment. Why must it be to night?" "He must not be in the court to morrow, and what difference will one day make? He must know it when the property is given up." Then there was a knock at the door, and a girl entered with a decanter, 2 wine glasses, and a slice or 2 of bread and butter. "You must drink that," said Mrs. Orme, pouring out a glass of wine. "And you?" "Yes, I will take some too." "There. I shall be stronger now." "Nay, Lady Mason, you shall drink it. And now, if you will take my advice, you will go to bed." "You will come to me again?" "Yes, directly it is over. Of course I shall come to you. Am I not to stay here all night?" "But him. I will not see him. He is not to come." "That will be as he pleases." "No, you promised that. I cannot see him when he knows what I have done for him." "Not to hear him say that he forgives you?" "He will not forgive me. You do not know him. Could you bear to look at your boy if you had disgraced him for ever?" "Whatever I might have done, he would not desert me, nor will Lucius desert you. Shall I go now?" "Ah me! Would that I were in my grave." Then Mrs. Orme bent over her and kissed her, pressed both her hands, then kissed her again, and silently creeping out of the room, made her way once more slowly down the stairs. Mrs. Orme, as will have been seen, was sufficiently anxious to perform the task which she had given herself, but yet her heart sank within her as she descended to the parlour. It was indeed a terrible commission, and her readiness to undertake it had come not from any feeling on her own part that she was fit for the work and could do it without difficulty, but from the eagerness with which she had persuaded Lady Mason that the thing must be done by some one. And now who else could do it? In Sir Peregrine's present state it would have been a cruelty to ask him. And then his feelings toward Lucius in the matter were not tender as were those of Mrs. Orme. She had been obliged to promise that she herself would do it, or otherwise she could not have urged the doing. And now the time had come. Immediately on their return to the house, Mrs. Orme had declared that the story should be told at once, and then Lady Mason, sinking into the chair from which she had not since risen, had at length agreed that it should be so. The time had now come, and Mrs. Orme, whose footsteps down the stairs had not been audible, stood for a moment with the handle of the door in her hand. Had it been possible, she also would now have put it off till the morrow, would have put it off till any other time than that which was then present. All manner of thoughts crowded on her during those few seconds. In what way should she do it? What words should she use? How should she begin? She was to tell this young man that his mother had committed a crime of the very blackest dye, and now she felt that she should have prepared herself and resolved in what fashion this should be done. Might it not be well, she asked herself for one moment, that she should take the night to think of it, and then see him in the morning? The idea, however, only lasted her for a moment, and then, fearing lest she might allow herself to be seduced into some weakness, she turned the handle and entered the room. He was still standing with his back to the fire, leaning against the mantelpiece, and thinking over the occurrences of the day that was past. His strongest feeling now was one of hatred to Joseph Mason, of hatred mixed with thorough contempt. What must men say of him after such a struggle on his part to ruin the fame of a lady and to steal the patrimony of a brother? "Is she still determined not to come down?" he said, as soon as he saw Mrs. Orme. "No, she will not come down to night, Mr. Mason. I have something that I must tell you." "What? Is she ill? Has it been too much for her?" "Mr. Mason," she said, "I hardly know how to do what I have undertaken." And he could see that she actually trembled as she spoke to him. "What is it, Mrs. Orme? Is it anything about the property? I think you need hardly be afraid of me. I believe I may say I could bear anything of that kind." "Mr. Mason," and then again she stopped herself. How was she to speak this horrible word? "Is it anything about the trial?" He was now beginning to be frightened, feeling that something terrible was coming, but still of the absolute truth he had no suspicion. "Oh, Mr. Mason, if it were possible that I could spare you, I would do so. If there were any escape, any way in which it might be avoided." "What is it?" said he, and now his voice was hoarse and low, for a feeling of fear had come upon him. "I am a man, and can bear it, whatever it is." "You must be a man then, for it is very terrible." "Mr. Mason, that will, you know." "You mean the codicil?" "The will that gave you the property." "Yes." "It was not done by your father." "Who says so?" "It is too sure. It was not done by him, nor by them, those other people who were in the court to day." "But who says so? How is it known? If my father did not sign it, it is a forgery. And who forged it? Those wretches have bought over some one, and you have been deceived, Mrs. Orme. It is not of the property I am thinking, but of my mother. If it were as you say, my mother must have known it." "Ah, yes." "And you mean that she did know it, that she knew it was a forgery? Oh, Mr. Mason!" "Heaven and earth! Let me go to her. If she were to tell me so herself, I would not believe it of her." "Ah, she has told you?" "Yes, she has told me." "Then she is mad. This has been too much for her, and her brain has gone with it. Let me go to her, Mrs. Orme." "No, no, you must not go to her." And Mrs. Orme put herself directly before the door. "She is not mad, not now. Then, at that time, we must think she was so. It is not so now." "I cannot understand you," and he put his left hand up to his forehead as though to steady his thoughts. "I do not understand you. If the will be a forgery, who did it?" This question she could not answer at the moment. She was still standing against the door, and her eyes fell to the ground. "Who did it?" he repeated. "Whose hand wrote my father's name?" You must be merciful, Mr. Mason." "Merciful? To whom?" "To your mother." "Merciful to my mother? Mrs. Orme, speak out to me. If the will was forged, who forged it? You cannot mean to tell me that she did it." She did not answer him at the moment in words, but coming close up to him, she took both his hands in hers, and then looked steadfastly up into his eyes. His face had now become almost convulsed with emotion, and his brow was very black. "Do you wish me to believe that my mother forged the will herself?" Then again he paused, but she said nothing. "Woman, it's a lie!" he exclaimed, and then tearing his hands from her, shaking her off, and striding away with quick footsteps, he threw himself on a sofa that stood in the furthest part of the room. She paused for a moment, and then followed him very gently. She followed him, and stood over him in silence for a moment, as he lay with his face from her. "Mr. Mason," she said at last, "you told me that you would bear this like a man." But he made her no answer, and she went on. "Mr. Mason, it is as I tell you. Years and years ago, when you were a baby, and when she thought that your father was unjust to you, for your sake, to remedy that injustice, she did this thing." "What, forged his name? It must be a lie. Though an angel came to tell me so, it would be a lie. What, my mother!" And now he turned round and faced her, still, however, lying on the sofa. "It is true, Mr. Mason. Oh, how I wish that it were not! But you must forgive her. It is years ago, and she has repented of it. Sir Peregrine has forgiven her, and I have done so." And then she told him the whole story. She told him why the marriage had been broken off, and described to him the manner in which the truth had been made known to Sir Peregrine. It need hardly be said that in doing so she dealt as softly as was possible with his mother's name, but yet she told him everything. She wrote it herself in the night. "What, all? All the names herself?" "Yes, all." "Mrs. Orme, it cannot be so. I will not believe it. To me it is impossible. That you believe it I do not doubt, but I cannot. Let me go to her. I will go to her myself. But even should she say so herself, I will not believe it." But she would not let him go upstairs, even though he attempted to move her from the door, almost with violence. "No, not till you say that you will forgive her and be gentle with her. And it must not be to night. We will be up early in the morning, and you can see her before we go, if you will be gentle to her." He still persisted that he did not believe the story, but it became clear to her by degrees that the meaning of it all had at last sunk into his mind, and that he did believe it. Over and over again she told him all that she knew, explaining to him what his mother had suffered, making him perceive why she had removed herself out of his hands and had leant on others for advice. And she told him also that though they still hoped that the jury might acquit her, the property must be abandoned. "I will leave the house this night if you wish it," he said. "When it is all over, when she has been acquitted and shall have gone away, then let it be done. Mr. Mason, you will go with her, will you not?" And then again there was a pause. "Mrs. Orme, it is impossible that I should say now what I may do. It seems to me as though I could not live through it. I do not believe it. I cannot believe it." As soon as she had exacted a promise from him that he would not go to his mother, at any rate without further notice, she herself went upstairs and found Lady Mason lying on her bed. At first Mrs. Orme thought that she was asleep, but no such comfort had come to the poor woman. "Does he know it?" she asked. Mrs. Orme's task for that night was by no means yet done. After remaining for a while with Lady Mason, she again returned to Lucius, and was in this way a bearer of messages between them. There was at last no question as to doubting the story. He did believe it. He could not avoid the necessity for such belief. "Yes," he said, when Mrs. Orme spoke again of his leaving the place, "I will go and hide myself. And as for her " "But you will go with her, if the jury do not say that she was guilty." "Oh, Mrs. Orme!" "If they do, you will come back for her when the time of her punishment is over. She is still your mother, Mr. Mason." At last the work of the night was done, and the two ladies went to their beds. The understanding was that Lucius should see his mother before they started in the morning, but that he should not again accompany them to the court. Mrs. Orme's great object had been, her great object as regarded the present moment, to prevent his presence in court when the verdict should be given. In this she had succeeded. She could now wish for an acquittal with a clear conscience, and could, as it were, absolve the sinner within her own heart, seeing that there was no longer any doubt as to the giving up of the property. Whatever might be the verdict of the jury, Joseph Mason of Groby would, without doubt, obtain the property which belonged to him. "Good night, Mr. Mason," Mrs. Orme said at last, as she gave him her hand. "Good night. I believe that in my madness I spoke to you to night like a brute." "No, no, it was nothing. I did not think of it." "When you think of how it was with me, you will forgive me." She pressed his hand, and again told him that she had not thought of it. It was nothing; and indeed it had been as nothing to her. There may be moments in a man's life when any words may be forgiven, even though they be spoken to a woman. When Mrs. Orme had gone he stood for a while perfectly motionless in the dining room, and then coming out into the hall he opened the front door, and taking his hat went out into the night. It was still winter, but the night, though cold and very dark, was fine, and the air was sharp with the beginning frost. Leaving the door open he walked forth, and passing out on to the road went down from thence to the gate. It had been his constant practice to walk up and down from his own hall door to his own gate on the high road, perhaps comforting himself too warmly with the reflection that the ground on which he walked was all his own. He had no such comfort now, as he made his way down the accustomed path, and leaned upon the gate, thinking over what he had heard. A forger! At some such hour as this, with patient, premeditated care, she had gone to work and committed one of the vilest crimes known to man. And this was his mother! And he, Lucius Mason, had been living for years on the fruit of this villainy, had been so living till this terrible day of retribution had come upon him. I fear that at that moment he thought more of his own misery than he did of hers, and hardly considered, as he surely should have done, that mother's love which had led to all this guilt. And for a moment he resolved that he would not go back to the house. His head, he said to himself, should never again rest under a roof which belonged of right to Joseph Mason. He had injured Joseph Mason, had injured him innocently indeed as far as he himself was concerned, but he had injured him greatly, and therefore now hated him all the more. "He shall have it instantly," he said, and walked forth into the high road as though he would not allow his feet to rest again on his brother's property. But he was forced to remember that this could not be so. His mother's trial was not yet over, and even in the midst of his own personal trouble he remembered that the verdict to her was still a matter of terrible import. He would not let it be known that he had abandoned the property, at any rate till that verdict had been given. And then, as he moved back to the house, he tried to think in what way it would become him to behave to his mother. "She can never be my mother again," he said to himself. They were terrible words, but then was not his position very terrible? And when at last he had bolted the front door, going through the accustomed task mechanically, and had gone upstairs to his own room, he had failed to make up his mind on this subject. Perhaps it would be better that he should not see her. What could he say to her? What word of comfort could he speak? It was not only that she had beggared him, Nay, it was not that at all, but she had doomed him to a life of disgrace which no effort of his own could wipe away. And then, as he threw himself on his bed, he thought of Sophia Furnival. Would she share his disgrace with him? Was it possible that there might be solace there? Quite impossible, we should say, who know her well. End of chapter 73 of Orley Farm by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 74 of Orley Farm by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 74. Young Lochinvar. Judge Stavely, whose court had not been kept sitting to a late hour by any such eloquence as that of Mr. Furnival, had gone home before the business of the other court had closed. Augustus, who was his father's marshal, remained for his friend, and had made his way in among the crowd so as to hear the end of the speech. "Don't wait dinner for us," he had said to his father. "If you do, you'll be hating us all the time, and we shan't be there till between 8 and 9. "I should be sorry to hate you," said the judge, "and so I won't." When therefore Felix Graham escaped from the court at about 7:30, the two young men were able to take their own time and eat their dinner together comfortably, enjoying their bottle of champagne between them perhaps more thoroughly than they would have done had the judge and Mrs. Stavely shared it with them. But Felix had something of which to think besides the champagne, something which was of more consequence to him even than the trial in which he was engaged. Madeline had promised that she would meet him that evening, or rather had not so promised. When asked to do so she had not refused, but even while not refusing had reminded him that her mother would be there. Her manner to him had, he thought, been cold, though she had not been ungracious. Upon the whole he could not make up his mind to expect success. Then he must have been a fool, the reader learned in such matters will say. The reader learned in such matters is, I think, right. In that respect he was a fool. "I suppose we must give the governor the benefit of our company over his wine," said Augustus, as soon as their dinner was over. "I suppose we ought to do so." "And why not? Is there any objection?" "To tell the truth," said Graham, "I have an appointment which I am very anxious to keep." "An appointment? Where? Here at Noningsby, do you mean?" "In this house. But yet I cannot say that it is absolutely an appointment. I am going to ask your sister what my fate is to be." "And that is the appointment. Very well, my dear fellow, and may God prosper you. If you can convince the governor that it is all right, I shall make no objection. I wish, for Madeline's sake, that you had not such a terrible bee in your bonnet." "And you will go to the judge alone?" "Oh yes, I'll tell him. What shall I tell him?" "The truth, if you will. Good bye, old fellow. You will not see me again to night, nor yet to morrow in this house, unless I am more fortunate than I have any right to hope to be." "Faint heart never won fair lady, you know," said Augustus. "My heart is faint enough then, but nevertheless I shall say what I have got to say." And then he got up from the table. "If you don't come down to us," said Augustus, "I shall come up to you. But may God speed you. And now I'll go to the governor." Felix made his way from the small breakfast parlour in which they had dined across the hall into the drawing room, and there he found Lady Staveley alone. "So the trial is not over yet, Mr. Graham," she said. "No, there will be another day of it." "And what will be the verdict? Is it possible that she really forged the will?" "Ah, that I cannot say. You know that I am one of her counsel, Lady Staveley." "Yes, I should have remembered that, and been more discreet. If you are looking for Madeline, Mr. Graham, I think that she is in the library." "Oh, thank you. In the library." And then Felix got himself out of the drawing room into the hall again, not in the most graceful manner. He might have gone direct from the drawing room to the library, but this he did not remember. It was very odd, he thought, that Lady Stavely, of whose dislike to him he had felt sure, should have thus sent him direct to her daughter, and have become a party, as it were, to an appointment between them. But he had not much time to think of this before he found himself in the room. There, sure enough, was Madeline, waiting to listen to his story. She was seated when he entered, with her back to him; but as she heard him she rose, and after pausing for a moment she stepped forward to meet him. "You and Augustus were very late to day," she said. "Yes, I was kept there, and he was good enough to wait for me." "You said you wanted to speak to me?" she said, hesitating a little, but yet very little. "To speak to me alone, and so mamma said I had better come in here. I hope you are not vexed that I should have told her." "Certainly not, Miss Staveley." "Because I have no secrets from mamma." "Nor do I wish that anything should be secret. I hate all secrecies. Miss Staveley, your father knows of my intention." On this point Madeline did not feel it to be necessary to say anything. Of course her father knew of the intention. Had she not received her father's sanction for listening to Mr. Graham, she would not have been alone with him in the library. It might be that the time would come in which she would explain all this to her lover, but that time had not come yet. So when he spoke of her father she remained silent, and allowing her eyes to fall to the ground, she stood before him, waiting to hear his question. "Miss Staveley," he said, and he was conscious himself of being very awkward, much more so indeed than there was any need, for Madeline was not aware that he was awkward. In her eyes he was quite master of the occasion, and seemed to have everything his own way. He had already done all that was difficult in the matter, and had done it without any awkwardness. He had already made himself master of her heart, and it was only necessary now that he should enter in and take possession. The ripe fruit had fallen, as Miss Furnival had once chosen to express it, and there he was to pick it up, if only he considered it worth his trouble to do so. That manner of the picking would not signify much, as Madeline thought. That he desired to take it into his garner and preserve it for his life's use was everything to her, but the method of his words at the present moment was not much. He was her lord and master. He was the one man who had conquered and taken possession of her spirit, and as to his being awkward, there was not much in that. Nor do I say that he was awkward. He spoke his mind in honest plain terms, and I do not know he could have done better. "Miss Staveley," he said, "in asking you to see me alone I have made a great venture. I am indeed risking all that I most value." And then he paused, as though he expected that she would speak, but she still kept her eyes upon the ground, and still stood silent before him. "I cannot but think you must guess my purpose," he said, "though I acknowledge that I have had nothing that can warrant me in hoping for a favourable answer. There is my hand. If you can take it, you need not doubt that you have my heart with it." And then he held out to her his broad right hand. Madeline still stood silent before him, and still fixed her eyes upon the ground, but very slowly she raised her little hand and allowed her soft slight fingers to rest upon his open palm. It was as though she thus affixed her legal signature and seal to the deed of gift. She had not said a word to him, not a word of love or a word of assent, but no such word was now necessary. "Madeline, my own Madeline," he said, and then taking unfair advantage of the fingers which she had given him, he drew her to his breast and folded her in his arms. It was nearly an hour after this when he returned to the drawing room. "Do go in now," she said. "You must not wait any longer. Indeed you must go." "And you will come in presently?" "It is already nearly 11. No, I will not show myself again to night. Mamma will soon come up to me, I know. Good night, Felix. Do you go now, and I will follow you." and then after some further little ceremony he left her. When he entered the drawing room Lady Staveley was there, and the judge with his teacup beside him, and Augustus standing with his back to the fire. Felix walked up to the circle, and taking a chair sat down, but at the moment said nothing. "You didn't get any wine after your day's toil, Master Graham," said the judge. "Indeed I did, sir. We had some champagne." "Champagne, had you? Then I ought to have waited for my guest, for I got none. You had a long day of it in court." "Yes, indeed, sir." "And I am afraid not very satisfactory." To this Graham made no immediate answer, but he could not refrain from thinking that the day, taken altogether, had been satisfactory to him. And then Baker came into the room, and going close up to Lady Staveley whispered something in her ear. Yes," said Lady Staveley. "I must wish you good night, Mr. Graham," and she took his hand, pressing it very warmly. But though she wished him good night then, she saw him again before he went to bed. It was a family in which all home affairs were very dear, and a new son could not be welcomed into it without much expression of affection. "Well, sir, and how have you sped since dinner?" the judge asked, as soon as the door was closed behind his wife. "I have proposed to your daughter, and she has accepted me." And as he said so he rose from the chair in which he had just now seated himself. "Then, my boy, I hope you will make her a good husband," and the judge gave him his hand. "I will try to do so. I cannot but feel, however, how little right I had to ask her, seeing that I am likely to be so poor a man." "Well, well, well, we will talk of that another time. At present we will only sing your triumphs. So faithful in love and so dauntless in war, there never was knight like the young Lochinvar. "Felix, my dear fellow, I congratulate you with all my heart," said Augustus, "but I did not know you were good as a warrior." "Ah, but he is, though," said the judge. "What do you think of his wounds? And if all that I hear be true, he has other battles on hand. But we must not speak about that till this poor lady's trial is over." "I need hardly tell you, sir," said Graham, with that sheep-like air which a man always carries on such occasions, "that I regard myself as the most fortunate man in the world." "Quite unnecessary," said the judge. "On such occasions that is taken as a matter of course." And then the conversation between them for the next 10 minutes was rather dull and flat. Upstairs the same thing was going on, in a manner somewhat more animated, between the mother and daughter; for ladies on such occasions can be more animated than men. "Oh, mamma, you must love him," Madeline said. "Yes, my dear, of course I shall love him now. Your papa says that he is very clever." "I know papa likes him. I knew that from the very first. I think that was the reason why. And I suppose clever people are the best, that is to say, if they are good." "And isn't he good?" "Well, I hope so. Indeed, I'm sure he is. Mr. Orme was a very good young man too, but it's no good talking about him now." "Mamma, that never could have come to pass." "Very well, my dear. It's over now, and of course all that I looked for was your happiness." "I know that, mamma, and indeed I am very happy. I'm sure I could not ever have liked any one else since I first knew him." Lady Staveley still thought it very odd, but she had nothing else to say. As regarded the pecuniary considerations of the affair, she left them altogether to her husband, feeling that in this way she could relieve herself from misgivings which might otherwise make her unhappy. "And after all, I don't know that his ugliness signifies," she said to herself; and so she made up her mind that she would be loving and affectionate to him, and sat up till she heard his footsteps in the passage, in order that she might speak to him and make him welcome to the privileges of a son-in-law. "Mr. Graham," she said, opening her door as he passed by. "Of course she has told you," said Felix. "Oh yes, she has told me. We don't have many secrets in this house. And I'm sure I congratulate you with all my heart, and I think you have got the very best girl in all the world. Of course I'm her mother, but I declare if I was to talk of her for a week I could not say anything of her but good." "I know how fortunate I am." "Yes, you are fortunate, for there is nothing in the world equal to a loving wife who will do her duty. And I'm sure you'll be good to her." "I will endeavour to be so." "A man must be very bad indeed who would be bad to her, and I don't think that of you. And it's a great thing, Mr. Graham, that Madeline should have loved a man of whom her papa is so fond. I don't know what you have done to the judge, I'm sure." This she said, remembering in the innocence of her heart that Mr. Arbuthnot had been a son-in-law rather after her own choice, and that the judge always declared that his eldest daughter's husband had seldom much to say for himself. "And I hope that Madeline's mother will receive me as kindly as Madeline's father," said he, taking Lady Staveley's hand and pressing it. "Indeed I will. I will love you very dearly if you will let me. My girls' husbands are the same to me as sons." Then she put up her face and he kissed it, and so they wished each other good night. He found Augustus in his own room, and they two had hardly sat themselves down over the fire, intending to recall the former scenes which had taken place in that very room, when a knock was heard at the door, and Mrs. Baker entered. "And so it's all settled, Mr. Felix," said she. "Yes," said he, "all settled." "Well now, didn't I know it from the first?" "Then what a wicked old woman you were not to tell," said Augustus. "That's all very well, Master Augustus. How would you like me to tell of you? For I could, you know." "You wicked old woman, you couldn't do anything of the kind." "Oh, couldn't I? But I defy all the world to say a word of Miss Madeline but what's good. Only I did know all along which way the wind was blowing. Lord love you, Mr. Graham, when you came in here all of a smash like, I knew it wasn't for nothing." "You think he did it on purpose, then?" said Staveley. "Did it on purpose? What? Make up to Miss Madeline? Why, of course he did it on purpose. He's been a thinking of it ever since Christmas night, when I saw you, Master Augustus, and a certain young lady, when you came out into the dark passage together." "That's a downright falsehood, Mrs. Baker." "Oh, very well. Perhaps I was mistaken. But now, Mr. Graham, if you don't treat our Miss Madeline well—" "That's just what I've been telling him," said her brother. "If he uses her ill, as he did his former wife, breaks her heart as he did with that one—" "His former wife!" said Mrs. Baker. "Haven't you heard of that? Why, he's had two already." "Two wives already!" "Oh, now, Master Augustus, what an old fool I am, ever to believe a word that comes out of your mouth." Then, having uttered her blessing, and having had her hand cordially grasped by this new scion of the Staveley family, the old woman left the young men to themselves, and went to her bed. "Now that is done," said Felix. "You wish it were undone?" "No, by heaven! I think I may venture to say that it will never come to me to wish that. But now that it is done, I am astonished at my own impudence almost as much as at my success. Why should your father have welcomed me to his house as his son-in-law, seeing how poor are my prospects?" "Just for that reason, and because he is so different from other men. I have no doubt that he is proud of Madeline for having liked a man with an ugly face and no money." "If I had been beautiful like you, I shouldn't have had a chance with him." "Not if you'd been weighted with money also. Now, as for myself, I confess I'm not nearly so magnanimous as my father, and for Mad's sake I do hope you will get rid of your vagaries. An income, I know, is a very commonplace sort of thing, but when a man has a family there are comforts attached to it." "I am at any rate willing to work," said Graham, somewhat moodily. "Yes, if you may work exactly in your own way. But men in the world can't do that. A man, as I take it, must through life allow himself to be governed by the united wisdom of others around him. He cannot take upon himself to judge as to every step by his own lights. If he does, he will be dead before he has made up his mind as to the preliminaries." And in this way Augustus Staveley, from the depth of his life's experience, spoke words of worldly wisdom to his future brother-in-law. On the next morning, before he started again for Alston and his now odious work, Graham succeeded in getting Madeline to himself for 5 minutes. "I saw both your father and mother last night," said he, "and I shall never forget their goodness to me." "Yes, they are good." "It seems like a dream to me that they should have accepted me as their son-in-law." "But it is no dream to me, Felix; or if so, I do not mean to wake any more. I used to think that I should never care very much for anybody out of my own family, but now " and she then pressed her little hand upon his arm. "And Felix," she said, as he prepared to leave her, "you are not to go away from Noningsby when the trial is over. I wanted mamma to tell you, but she said I'd better do it." End of Chapter 74 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 75 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 75. The Last Day. Mrs. Orme was up very early on that last morning of the trial, and had dressed herself before Lady Mason was awake. It was now March, but yet the morning light was hardly sufficient for her as she went through her toilet. They had been told to be in the court very punctually at 10, and in order to do so they must leave Orley Farm at 9. Before that, as had been arranged overnight, Lucius was to see his mother. "You haven't told him? He doesn't know?" were the first words which Lady Mason spoke as she raised her head from the pillow. But then she remembered. "Ah, yes," she said, as she again sank back and hid her face. "He knows it all now." "Yes, dear, he knows it all. And is it not better so? He will come and see you, and when that is over you will be more comfortable than you have been for years past." Lucius also had been up early, and when he learned that Mrs. Orme was dressed, he sent up to her, begging that he might see her. Mrs. Orme at once went to him, and found him seated at the breakfast table, with his head resting on his arm. His face was pale and haggard, and his hair was uncombed. He had not been undressed that night, and his clothes hung on him as they always do hang on a man who has passed a sleepless night in them. To Mrs. Orme's inquiry after himself he answered not a word, nor did he at first ask after his mother. "That was all true that you told me last night?" "Yes, Mr. Mason, it was true." "And she and I must be outcasts for ever. I will endeavour to bear it, Mrs. Orme. As I did not put an end to my life last night, I suppose that I shall live and bear it. Does she expect to see me?" "I told her that you would come to her this morning." "And what shall I say? I would not condemn my own mother, but how can I not condemn her?" "Tell her at once that you will forgive her." "But it will be a lie. I have not forgiven her. I loved my mother, and esteemed her as a pure and excellent woman. I was proud of my mother. How can I forgive her for having destroyed such feelings as those?" "There should be nothing that a son would not forgive his mother." "Ah, that is so easily spoken. Men talk of forgiveness when their anger rankles deepest in their hearts. In the course of years I shall forgive her. I hope I shall. But to say that I can forgive her now would be a farce. She has broken my heart, Mrs. Orme." "And has not she suffered herself? Is not her heart broken?" "I have been thinking of that all night. I cannot understand how she should have lived for the last 6 months. Well, is it time that I should go to her?" Mrs. Orme again went up stairs, and after another interval of half an hour returned to fetch him. She almost regretted that she had undertaken to bring them together on that morning, thinking that it might have been better to postpone the interview till the trial should be over. She had expected that Lucius would have been softer in his manner, but it was too late for any such thought. "You will find her dressed now, Mr. Mason," said she; "but I conjure you, as you hope for mercy yourself, to be merciful to her. She is your mother, and though she has injured you by her folly, her heart has been true to you through it all. Go now, and remember that harshness to any woman is unmanly." "I can only act as I think best," he replied, in that low stern voice which was habitual to him; and then with slow steps he went up to his mother's room. When he entered it she was standing with her eyes fixed upon the door, and her hands clasped together. So she stood till he had closed the door behind him, and had taken a few steps on towards the centre of the room. Then she rushed forward, and throwing herself on the ground before him, clasped him round the knees with her arms. "My boy," she said, and then she lay there bathing his feet with her tears. "Oh, mother, what is this that she has told me?" But Lady Mason at the moment spoke no further words. It seemed as though her heart would have burst with sobs, and when for a moment she lifted up her face to his, the tears were streaming down her cheeks. Had it not been for that relief, she could not have borne the sufferings which were heaped upon her. "Mother, get up," he said. "Let me raise you. It is dreadful that you should lie there. Mother, let me lift you." But she still clung to his knees, grovelling on the ground before him. "Lucius, Lucius," she said, and she then sank away from him, as though the strength of her muscles would no longer allow her to cling to him. She sank away from him, and lay along the ground, hiding her face upon the floor. "Mother," he said, taking her gently by the arm as he knelt at her side, "if you will rise I will speak to you." "Your words will kill me," she said. "I do not dare to look at you. Oh, Lucius, will you ever forgive me?" And yet she had done it all for him. She had done a rascally deed, an hideous cut-throat deed, but it had been done altogether for him. No thought of her own aggrandisement had touched her mind when she resolved upon that forgery. As Rebekah had deceived her lord and robbed Esau, the firstborn, of his birthright, so had she robbed him who was as Esau to her. How often had she thought of that while her conscience was pleading hard against her! Had it been imputed as a crime to Rebekah that she had loved her own son well, and loving him had put a crown upon his head by means of her matchless guile? Did she love Lucius, her babe, less than Rebekah had loved Jacob? And had she not striven with the old man, struggling that she might do this just thing without injustice, till in his anger he had thrust her from him? "I will not break my promise for the brat," the old man had said. And then she did the deed. But all that was as nothing now. She felt no comfort now from that Bible story which had given her such encouragement before the thing was finished. Now the result of evil doing had come full home to her, and she was seeking pardon with a broken heart, while burning tears furrowed her cheeks, not from him whom she had thought to injure, but from the child of her own bosom, for whose prosperity she had been so anxious. Then she slowly arose and allowed him to place her upon the sofa. "Mother," he said, "it is all over here." "Ah, yes. Whither we had better go I cannot yet say, or when. We must wait till this day is ended." "Lucius, I care nothing for myself, nothing. It is nothing to me whether or no they say that I am guilty. It is of you only that I am thinking." "Our lot, mother, must still be together. If they find you guilty, you will be imprisoned, and then I will go, and come back when they release you. For you and me the future world will be very different from the past." "It need not be so for you, Lucius. I do not wish to keep you near me now." "But I shall be near you." Where you hide your shame, there will I hide mine. In this world there is nothing left for us. But there is another world before you, if you can repent of your sin." This too he said very sternly, standing somewhat away from her, and frowning the while with those gloomy eyebrows. Sad as was her condition, he might have given her solace could he have taken her by the hand and kissed her. Peregrine Orme would have done so, or Augustus Staveley, could it have been possible that they should have found themselves in that position. Though Lucius Mason could not do so, he was not less just than they, and it may be not less loving in his heart. He could devote himself for his mother's sake as absolutely as could they. But to some is given and to some is denied that cruse of heavenly balm with which all wounds can be assuaged, and sore hearts ever relieved of some portion of their sorrow. Of all the virtues with which man can endow himself, surely none other is so odious as that justice which can teach itself to look down upon mercy almost as a vice. "I will not ask you to forgive me," she said plaintively. "Mother," he answered, "were I to say that I forgave you, my words would be a mockery. I have no right either to condemn or to forgive. I accept my position as it has been made for me, and I will endeavour to do my duty." It would have been almost better for her that he should have upbraided her for her wickedness. She would then have fallen again prostrate before him, if not in body at least in spirit, and her weakness would have stood for her in place of strength. But now it was necessary that she should hear his words and bear his looks, bear them like a heavy burden on her back, without absolutely sinking. It had been that necessity of bearing and never absolutely sinking which, during years past, had so tried and tested the strength of her heart and soul. Seeing that she had not sunk, we may say that her strength had been very wonderful. And then she stood up and came close to him. "But you will give me your hand, Lucius?" "Yes, mother, there is my hand. I shall stand by you through it all." But he did not offer to kiss her, and there was still some pride in her heart which would not allow her to ask him for an embrace. "And now," he said, "it is time that you should prepare to go. Mrs. Orme thinks it better that I should not accompany you." "No, Lucius, no. You must not hear them proclaim my guilt in court." "That would make but little difference. But nevertheless I will not go. Had I known this before, I should not have gone there. It was to testify my belief in your innocence, nay, my conviction." "Oh, Lucius, spare me." "Well, I will speak of it no more. I shall be here to night when you come back." "But if they say that I am guilty, they will take me away." "If so, I will come to you in the morning, if they will let me. But, mother, in any case I must leave this house to morrow." Then again he gave her his hand, but he left her without touching her with his lips. When the two ladies appeared in court together without Lucius Mason, there was much question among the crowd as to the cause of his absence. Both Dockwrath and Joseph Mason looked at it in the right light, and accepted it as a ground for renewed hope. "He dare not face the verdict," said Dockwrath. And yet when they had left the court on the preceding evening, after listening to Mr. Furnival's speech, their hopes had not been very high. Dockwrath had not admitted with words that he feared defeat; but when Mason had gnashed his teeth as he walked up and down his room at Alston, and striking the table with his clenched fists, had declared his fears, "By heavens, they will escape me again," Dockwrath had not been able to give him substantial comfort. "The jury are not such fools as to take all that for gospel," he had said. But he had not said it with that tone of assured conviction which he had always used till Mr. Furnival's speech had been made. There could have been no greater attestation to the power displayed by Mr. Furnival than Mr. Mason's countenance as he left the court on that evening. "I suppose it will cost me hundreds of pounds," he said to Dockwrath that evening. "Orley Farm will pay for it all," Dockwrath had answered. But his answer had shown no confidence; and if we think well of it, Joseph Mason was deserving of pity. He wanted only what was his own, and that Orley Farm ought to be his own he had no smallest doubt. Mr. Furnival had not in the least shaken him, but he had made him feel that others would be shaken. "If it could only be left to the judge," thought Mr. Mason to himself; and then he began to consider whether this British palladium of an unanimous jury had not in it more of evil than of good. Young Peregrine Orme again met his mother at the door of the court, and at her instance gave his arm to Lady Mason. Mr. Aram was also there, but Mr. Aram had great tact, and did not offer his arm to Mrs. Orme, contenting himself with making a way for her and walking beside her. "I am glad that her son has not come to day," he said, not bringing his head suspiciously close to hers, but still speaking so that none but she might hear him. "He has done all the good that he could do, and as there is only the judge's charge to hear, the jury will not notice his absence. Of course we hope for the best, Mrs. Orme, but it is doubtful." As Felix Graham took his place next to Chaffanbrass, the old lawyer scowled at him, turning his red old savage eyes first on him and then from him, growling the while, so that the whole court might notice it. The legal portion of the court did notice it, and were much amused. "Good morning, Mr. Chaffanbrass," said Graham, quite aloud as he took his seat; and then Chaffanbrass growled again. Considering the lights with which he had been lightened, there was a species of honesty about Mr. Chaffanbrass which certainly deserved praise. He was always true to the man whose money he had taken, and gave to his customer, with all the power at his command, that assistance which he had professed to sell. But we may give the same praise to the hired bravo who goes through with truth and courage the task which he has undertaken. I knew an assassin in Ireland who professed that during 12 years of practice in Tipperary he had never failed when he had once engaged himself. For truth and honesty to their customers, which are great virtues, I would bracket that man and Mr. Chaffanbrass together. And then the judge commenced his charge, and as he went on with it he repeated all the evidence that was in any way of moment, pulling the details to pieces, and dividing that which bore upon the subject from that which did not. This he did with infinite talent, and with a perspicuity beyond all praise. But to my thinking it was remarkable that he seemed to regard the witnesses as a dissecting surgeon may be supposed to regard the subjects on which he operates for the advancement of science. With exquisite care he displayed what each had said, and how the special saying of one bore on that special saying of another. But he never spoke of them as though they had been live men and women who were themselves as much entitled to justice at his hands as either the prosecutor in this matter or she who was being prosecuted, who indeed, if anything, were better entitled, unless he could show that they were false and suborned. For unless they were suborned or false, they were there doing a painful duty to the public, for which they were to receive no pay, and from which they were to obtain no benefit. Of whom else in that court could so much be said? The judge there had his ermine and his canopy, his large salary and his seat of honour; and the lawyers had their wigs and their own loud voices and their places of precedence. The attorneys had their seats and their big tables, and the somewhat familiar respect of the tipstaves. The jury, though not much to be envied, were addressed with respect and flattery, had their honourable seats, and were invariably at least called gentlemen. But why should there be no seat of honour for the witnesses? To stand in a box, to be bawled after by the police, to be scowled at and scolded by the judge, to be browbeaten and accused falsely by the barristers, and then to be condemned as perjurers by the jury, That is the fate of the one person who during the whole trial is perhaps entitled to the greatest respect, and is certainly entitled to the most public gratitude. Let the witness have a big arm chair and a canopy over him, and a man behind him with a red cloak to do him honour and keep the flies off. Let him be gently invited to come forward from some inner room where he can sit before a fire. Then he will be able to speak out, making himself heard without scolding, and will perhaps be able to make a fair fight with the cocks who can crow so loudly on their own dunghills. The judge in this case did his work with admirable skill, blowing aside the froth of Mr. Furnival's eloquence, and upsetting the sophistry and false deductions of Mr. Chaffanbrass. The case for the jury, as he said, hung altogether upon the evidence of Kenneby and the woman Bolster. As far as he could see, the evidence of Dockwrath had little to do with it, and alleged malice and greed on the part of Dockwrath could have nothing to do with it. The jury might take it as proved that Lady Mason at the former trial had sworn that she had been present when her husband signed the codicil, and had seen the different signatures affixed to it. They might also take it as proved that that other deed, the deed purporting to close a partnership between Sir Joseph Mason and Mr. Martock, had been executed on the 14th of July, and that it had been signed by Sir Joseph, and also by those two surviving witnesses, Kenneby and Bolster. The question, therefore, for the consideration of the jury had narrowed itself to this: had two deeds been executed by Sir Joseph Mason, both bearing the same date? If this had not been done, and if that deed with reference to the partnership were a true deed, then must the other be false and fraudulent; and if false and fraudulent, then must Lady Mason have sworn falsely, and been guilty of that perjury with which she was now charged. There might perhaps be one loophole to this argument by which an escape was possible. Though both deeds bore the date of 14th July, there might have been error in this. It was possible, though no doubt singular, that that date should have been inserted in the partnership deed, and the deed itself be executed afterwards. But then the woman Bolster told them that she had been called to act as witness but once in her life, and if they believed her in that statement, the possibility of error as to the date would be of little or no avail on behalf of Lady Mason. For himself, he could not say that adequate ground had been shown for charging Bolster with swearing falsely. No doubt she had been obstinate in her method of giving her testimony, but that might have arisen from an honest resolution on her part not to allow herself to be shaken. The value of her testimony must, however, be judged by the jury themselves. As regarded Kenneby, he must say that the man had been very stupid. No one who had heard him would accuse him for a moment of having intended to swear falsely, but the jury might perhaps think that the testimony of such a man could not be taken as having much value with reference to circumstances which happened more than 20 years since. The charge took over 2 hours, but the substance of it has been stated. Then the jury retired to consider their verdict, and the judge and the barristers and some other jury proceeded to the business of some other and less important trial. Lady Mason and Mrs. Orme sat for a while in their seats, perhaps for a space of 20 minutes, and then, as the jury did not at once return into court, they retired to the sitting room in which they had first been placed. Here Mr. Aram accompanied them, and here they were of course met by Peregrine Orme. "His lordship's charge was very good indeed," said Mr. Aram. "Oh, was it?" asked Peregrine. "And very much in our favour," continued the attorney. "You think then," said Mrs. Orme, looking up into his face, "you think that " But she did not know how to go on with her question. "Yes, I do. I think we shall have a verdict. I do indeed. I would not say so before Lady Mason if my opinion was not very strong. The jury may disagree. That is not improbable. But I cannot anticipate that the verdict will be against us." There was some comfort in this, but how wretched was the nature of the comfort! Did not the attorney, in every word which he spoke, declare his own conviction of his client's guilt? Even Peregrine Orme could not say out boldly that he felt sure of an acquittal because no other verdict could be justly given. And then why was not Mr. Furnival there, taking his friend by the hand and congratulating her that her troubles were so nearly over? Mr. Furnival at this time did not come near her, and had he done so, what could he have said to her? He and Sir Richard Leatherham left the court together, and the latter went at once back to London without waiting to hear the verdict. Mr. Chaffanbrass also and Felix Graham retired from the scene of their labours, and as they did so a few words were spoken between them. "Mr. Graham," said the ancient hero of the Old Bailey, "you are too great for this kind of work, I take it. If I were you, I would keep out of it for the future." "I am very much of the same way of thinking, Mr. Chaffanbrass," said the other. "If a man undertakes a duty he should do it. That's my opinion, though I confess it's a little old-fashioned, especially if he takes money for it, Mr. Graham." And then the old man glowered at him with his fierce eyes, and nodded his head, and went on. What could Graham say to him? His answer would have been ready enough had there been time or place in which to give it, but he had no answer ready which was fit for the crowded hall of the court house, and so Mr. Chaffanbrass went on his way. He will now pass out of our sight, and we will say of him that he did his duty well according to his lights. There in that little room sat Lady Mason and Mrs. Orme till late in the evening, and there with them remained Peregrine. Some sort of refreshment was procured for them, but of the 3 days they passed in the court, that perhaps was the most oppressive. There was no employment for them, and then the suspense was terrible. That suspense became worse and worse as the hours went on, for it was clear that at any rate some of the jury were anxious to give a verdict against her. "They say that there's 8 and 4, said Mr. Aram at one of the many visits which he made to them, "but there's no saying how true that may be." "8 and 4, said Peregrine. "8 to acquit, and 4 for guilty," said Aram. "If so, we're safe at any rate till the next assizes." But it was not fated that Lady Mason should be sent away from the court in doubt. At 8 o'clock Mr. Aram came to them hot with haste, and told them that the jury had sent for the judge. The judge had gone home to his dinner, but would return to court at once when he heard that the jury had agreed. "And must we go into court again?" said Mrs. Orme. "Lady Mason must do so." "Then of course I shall go with her. Are you ready now, dear?" Lady Mason was unable to speak, but she signified that she was ready, and then they went into court. The jury were already in the box, and as the 2 ladies took their seats the judge entered. But few of the gas lights were lit, so that they in the court could hardly see each other, and the remaining ceremony did not take 5 minutes. "Not guilty, my lord," said the foreman. Then the verdict was recorded, and the judge went back to his dinner. Joseph Mason and Dockwrath were present and heard the verdict. I will leave the reader to imagine with what an appetite they returned to their chamber. End of Chapter 75 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 76 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 76. I Love Her Still. It was all over now, and as Lucius had said to his mother, there was nothing left for them but to go and hide themselves. The verdict had reached him before his mother's return, and on the moment of his hearing it he sat down and commenced the following letter to Mr. Furnival. Orley Farm, March, 18. Dear Sir, I beg to thank you in my mother's name for your great exertions in the late trial. I must acknowledge that I have been wrong in thinking that you gave her bad advice, and am now convinced that you acted with the best judgment on her behalf. May I beg that you will add to your great kindness by inducing the gentlemen who undertook the management of the case as my mother's attorneys to let me know as soon as possible in what sum I am indebted to them. I believe I need trouble you with no preamble as to my reasons when I tell you that I have resolved to abandon immediately any title that I may have to the possession of Orley Farm, and to make over the property at once in any way that may be most efficacious to my half-brother, Mr. Joseph Mason of Groby Park. I so strongly feel the necessity of doing this at once, without even a day's delay, that I shall take my mother to lodgings in London to morrow, and shall then decide on what steps it may be best that we shall take. My mother will be in possession of about £200 a year, subject to such deduction as the cost of the trial may make from it. I hope that you will not think that I intrude upon you too far when I ask you to communicate with my brother's lawyers on the subject of this surrender. I do not know how else to do it, and of course you will understand that I wish to screen my mother's name as much as may be in my power with due regard to honesty. I hope I need not insist on the fact, for it is a fact, that nothing will change my purpose as to this. If I cannot have it done through you, I must myself go to Mr. Round. I am moreover aware that in accordance with strict justice my brother should have upon me a claim for the proceeds of the estate since the date of our father's death. If he wishes it, I will give him such claim, making myself his debtor by any form that may be legal. He must, however, in such case be made to understand that his claim will be against a beggar. But nevertheless it may suit his views to have such a claim upon me. I cannot think that, under the circumstances, I should be justified in calling on my mother to surrender her small income, but should you be of a different opinion, it shall be done. I write thus to you at once, as I think that not a day should be lost. I will trouble you with another line from London to let you know what is our immediate address. Pray believe me to be yours faithfully and obliged, Lucius Mason. T. Furnival, Esquire, Old Square, Lincoln's Inn Fields. As soon as he had completed this letter, which was sufficiently good for its purpose, and clearly explained what was the writer's will on the subject of it, he wrote another which I do not think was equally efficacious. The second was addressed to Miss Furnival, and being a love letter, was not so much within the scope of the writer's peculiar powers. Dearest Sophia, I hardly know how to address you, or what I should tell you, or what conceal. Were we together, and was that promise renewed which you once gave me, I should tell you all. But this I cannot do by letter. My mother's trial is over, and she is acquitted. But that which I have learned during the trial has made me feel that I am bound to relinquish to my brother-in-law all my title to Orley Farm, and I have already taken the first steps towards doing so. Yes, Sophia, I am now a beggar on the face of the world. I have nothing belonging to me save those powers of mind and body which God has given me, and I am moreover a man oppressed with a terribly heavy load of grief. For some short time I must hide myself with my mother, and then, when I shall have been able to brace my mind to work, I shall go forth and labour in whatever field may be open to me. But before I go, Sophia, I wish to say a word of farewell to you, that I may understand on what terms we part. Of course I make no claim. I am aware that that which I now tell you must be held as giving you a valid excuse for breaking any contract that there may have been between us. But nevertheless I have hope. That I love you very dearly I need hardly now say, and I still venture to think that the time may come when I shall again prove myself to be worthy of your hand. If you have ever loved me, you cannot cease to do so merely because I am unfortunate. And if you love me still, perhaps you will consent to wait. If you will do so, if you will say that I am rich in that respect, I shall go to my banishment not altogether a downcast man. May I say that I am still your own Lucius Mason? No, he decidedly might not say so. But as the letter was not yet finished when his mother and Mrs. Orme returned, I will not anticipate matters by giving Miss Furnival's reply. Mrs. Orme came back that night to Orley Farm, but without the intention of remaining there. Her task was over, and it would be well that she should return to The Cleeve. Her task was over, and as the hour must come in which she would leave the mother in the hands of her son, the present hour would be as good as any. They again went together to the room which they had shared for the last night or two, and there they parted. They had not been there long when the sound of wheels was heard on the gravel, and Mrs. Orme got up from her seat. "There is Peregrine with the carriage," said she. "And are you going?" said Lady Mason. "If I could do you good I would stay," said Mrs. Orme. "No, no, of course you must go. Oh, my darling, oh, my friend!" and she threw herself into the other's arms. "Of course I will write to you," said Mrs. Orme. "I will do so regularly." "May God bless you for ever! But it is needless to ask for blessings on such as you. You are blessed." "And you too. If you will turn to him you will be blessed." "Ah, me! Well, I can try now. I feel that I can at any rate try." "And none who try ever fail. And now, dear, good-bye." "Good-bye, my angel. But, Mrs. Orme, I have one word I must first say, a message that I must send to him. Tell him this, that never in my life have I loved any man as well as I have loved him, and as I do love him, that on my knees I beg his pardon for the wrong I have done him." "But he knows how great has been your goodness to him." "When the time came I was not quite a devil to drag him down with me to utter destruction." "He will always remember what was your conduct then." "But tell him that though I loved him, and though I loved you with all my heart, I knew through it all, as I know now, that I was not a fitting friend for him or you. No, do not interrupt me. I always knew it, and though it was so sweet to me to see your faces, I would have kept away. But that he would not have it. I came to him to assist me because he was great and strong, and he took me to his bosom with his kindness, till I destroyed his strength, though his greatness nothing can destroy." "No, no, he does not think that you have injured him. But tell him what I say, and tell him that a poor bruised broken creature, who knows at least her own vileness, will pray for him night and morning. And now good-bye. Of my heart towards you I cannot speak." "Good-bye then, and, Lady Mason, never despair. There is always room for hope, and where there is hope there need not be unhappiness." Then they parted, and Mrs. Orme went down to her son. "Mother, the carriage is here," he said. "Yes, I heard it. Where is Lucius?" "Good-bye, Mr. Mason." "God bless you, Mrs. Orme. Believe me, I know how good you have been to us." As she gave him her hand she spoke a few words to him. "My last request to you, Mr. Mason, is to beg that you will be tender to your mother." "I will do my best, Mrs. Orme." "All her sufferings and your own have come from her great love for you. "That I know and feel. But had her ambition for me been less, it would have been better for both of us." And there he stood bareheaded at the door, while Peregrine Orme handed his mother into the carriage. Thus Mrs. Orme took her last leave of Orley Farm, and was parted from the woman she has loved with so much truth and befriended with so much loyalty. Very few words were spoken in the carriage between Peregrine and his mother while they were being taken back through Hamworth to The Cleeve. To Peregrine the whole matter was unintelligible. He knew that the verdict had been in favour of Lady Mason, and yet there had been no signs of joy at Orley Farm, or even of contentment. He had heard also from Lucius, while they had been together for a few minutes, that Orley Farm was to be given up. "You'll let it, I suppose?" Peregrine had asked. "It will not be mine to let. It will belong to my brother," Lucius had answered. Then Peregrine had asked no further question, nor had Lucius offered any further information. But his mother, as he knew, was worn out with the work she had done, and at the present moment he felt that the subject was one which would hardly bear questions. So he sat by her side in silence, and before the carriage had reached The Cleeve his mind had turned away from the cares and sorrows of Lady Mason, and was once more at Noningsby. After all, as he said to himself, who could be worse off than he was? He had nothing to hope. They found Sir Peregrine standing in the hall to receive them, and Mrs. Orme, though she had been absent only 3 days, could not but perceive the havoc which this trial had made upon him. It was not that the sufferings of those 3 days had broken him down, but that now, after that short absence, she was able to perceive how great had been upon him the effect of his previous sufferings. He had never held up his head since the day on which Lady Mason had made to him her first confession. Up to that time he had stood erect, and though as he walked his steps had shown that he was no longer young, he had walked with a certain air of strength and manly bearing. Till Lady Mason had come to The Cleeve, no one would have said that Sir Peregrine looked as though his energy and life had passed away. But now, as he put his arm round his daughter's waist and stooped down to kiss her cheek, he was a worn-out, tottering old man. During these 3 days he had lived almost altogether alone, and had been ashamed to show to those around him the intense interest which he felt in the result of the trial. His grandson had on each day breakfasted alone, and had left the house before his grandfather was out of his room, and on each evening he had returned late, as he now returned with his mother, and had dined alone. Then he had sat with his grandfather for an hour or two, and had been constrained to talk over the events of the day without being allowed to ask Sir Peregrine's opinion as to Lady Mason's innocence, or to express his own. These 3 days had been dreadful to Sir Peregrine. He had not left the house, but had crept about from room to room, ever and again taking up some book or paper and putting it down unread, as his mind reverted to the one subject which now for him bore any interest. On the second of these 3 days a note had been brought to him from his old friend Lord Alston. "Dear Orme," the note had run, "I am not quite happy as I think of the manner in which we parted the other day. If I offended in any degree, I send this as a peacemaker, and beg to shake your hand heartily. Let me have a line from you to say that it is all right between us. Neither you nor I can afford to lose an old friend at our time of life. Yours always, Alston." But Sir Peregrine had not answered it. Lord Alston's servant had been dismissed with a promise that an answer should be sent, but at the end of the 3 days it had not yet been written. His mind, indeed, was still sore towards Lord Alston. The counsel which his old friend had given him was good and true, but it had been neglected, and its very truth and excellence now made the remembrance of it unpalatable. He had nevertheless intended to write, but the idea of such exertion from hour to hour had become more distressing to him. He had of course heard of Lady Mason's acquittal, and indeed tidings of the decision to which the jury had come went through the country very quickly. There is a telegraphic wire for such tidings which has been very long in use, and which, though always used, is as yet but very little understood. How is it that information will spread itself quicker than men can travel, and make its way like water into all parts of the world? It was known all through the country that night that Lady Mason was acquitted, and before the next night it was as well known that she had acknowledged her guilt by giving up the property. Little could be said as to the trial while Peregrine remained in the room with his mother and his grandfather, but this he had the tact to perceive, and soon left them together. "I shall see you, mother, upstairs before you go to bed," he said, as he sauntered out.
"But you must not keep her up," said his grandfather. "Remember all that she has gone through."
With this injunction he went off, and as he sat alone in his mother's room he tried to come to some resolution as to Noningsby. He knew he had no ground for hope, no chance, as he would have called it, and if so, would it not be better that he should take himself off? Nevertheless, he would go to Noningsby once more. He would not be such a coward but that he would wish her good-bye before he went, and hear the end of it all from her own lips. When he had left the room, Lady Mason's last message was given to Sir Peregrine.
"Poor, poor soul," he said, as Mrs. Orme began her story. "Her son knows it all then now."
"I told him last night, with her consent, so that he should not go into the court to day. It would have been very bad, you know, if they had found her guilty."
"Yes, yes, very bad indeed. Poor creature! And so you told him. How did he bear it?"
"On the whole, well. At first he would not believe me."
"As for me, I could not have done it. I could not have told him."
"Yes, sir, you would. You would if it had been required of you."
"I think it would have killed me. But a woman can do things for which a man's courage would never be sufficient." And he bore it manfully.
"He was very stern."
"Yes, and he will be stern. Poor soul, I pity her from my very heart. But he will not desert her. He will do his duty by her."
"I am sure he will. In that respect he is a good young man."
"Yes, my dear. He is one of those who seem by nature created to bear adversity. No trouble or sorrow would, I think, crush him. But had prosperity come to him, it would have made him odious to all around him." "You were not present when they met?"
"No, I thought it better to leave them."
"Yes, yes. And he will give up the place at once."
"To morrow he will do so. In that at any rate he has true spirit. To morrow early they will go to London, and she, I suppose, will never see Orley Farm again." And then Mrs. Orme gave Sir Peregrine that last message. "I tell you everything as she told me," Mrs. Orme said, seeing how deeply he was affected. "Perhaps I am wrong."
"No, no, no," he said.
Coming at such a moment, her words seemed to be almost sacred.
"They are sacred. They shall be sacred. Poor soul, poor soul!"
"She did a great crime."
"Yes, yes."
"But if a crime can be forgiven, can be excused on account of its motives—"
"It cannot, my dear. Nothing can be forgiven on that ground."
"No, we know that. We all feel sure of that. But yet how can one help loving her? For myself, I shall love her always."
"And I also love her."
And then the old man made his confession.
"I loved her well, better than I had ever thought to love any one again, but you and Perry. I love her very dearly, and felt that I should have been proud to have called her my wife. How beautiful she was in her sorrow, when we thought that her life had been pure and good. And it had been good for many years past. No, for the stolen property was still there. But yet how graceful she was, and how well her sorrows sat upon her! What might she not have done had the world used her more kindly, and not sent in her way that sore temptation? She was a woman for a man to have loved to madness. And yet how little can she have known of love! I loved her. And as the old man said so, he rose to his feet with some show of his old energy. I loved her with all my heart. It is foolish for an old man so to say, but I did love her. Nay, I love her still. But that I knew that it would be wrong, for your sake and for Perry's. And then he stopped himself, as though he would fain hear what she might say to him. "Yes, it is all over now," she said, in the softest, sweetest, lowest voice. She knew that she was breaking down a last hope, but she knew also that that hope was vain. And then there was silence in the room for some 10 minutes' space. "It is all over," he then said, repeating her last words. "But you have us still, Perry and me. Can any one love you better than we do?" And she got up and went over to him, and stood by him, and leaned upon him. "Edith, my love, since you came to my house, there has been an angel in it watching over me. I shall know that always. And when I turn my face to the wall, as I soon shall, that shall be my last earthly thought." And so in tears they parted for that night. But the sorrow that was bringing him to his grave came from the love of which he had spoken. It is seldom that a young man may die from a broken heart. But if an old man have a heart still left to him, it is more fragile. End of chapter 76 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 77 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 77. John Kenneby's Doom. On the evening but one after the trial was over, Mr. Moulder entertained a few friends to supper at his apartments in Great St. Helens, and it was generally understood that in doing so he intended to celebrate the triumph of Lady Mason. Through the whole affair he had been a strong partisan on her side, had expressed a very loud opinion in favour of Mr. Furnival, and had hoped that that scoundrel Dockwrath would get all that he deserved from the hands of Mr. Chaffanbrass. When the hour of Mr. Dockwrath's punishment had come, he had been hardly contented, but the inadequacy of Kenneby's testimony had restored him to good humour, and the verdict had made him triumphant. "Didn't I know it, old fellow?" he had said, slapping his friend Snengkeld on the back. "When such a low scoundrel as Dockwrath is pitted against a handsome woman like Lady Mason, he'll not find a jury in England to give a verdict in his favour." Then he asked Snengkeld to come to his little supper, and Kantwise also he invited, though Kantwise had shown Dockwrath tendencies throughout the whole affair. But Moulder was fond of Kantwise as a butt for his own sarcasm. Mrs. Smiley too was asked, as was natural, seeing that she was the betrothed bride of one of the heroes of the day; and Moulder, in the kindness of his heart, swore that he never was proud, and told Bridget Bolster that she would be welcome to take a share of what was going. "Laws, M," said Mrs. Moulder, when she was told of this, "a chambermaid from an inn! What will Mrs. Smiley say?" "I ain't going to trouble myself with what Mother Smiley may say or think about my friends. If she don't like it, she may do the other thing. What was she herself when you first knew her?"
Yes, Moulder, but in money do make a difference, you know." Bridget Bolster, however, was invited, and she came in spite of the grandeur of Mrs. Smiley. Kenneby also of course was there, but he was not in a happy frame of mind. Since that wretched hour in which he had heard himself described by the judge as too stupid to be held of any account by the jury, he had become a melancholy, misanthropic man. The treatment which he received from Mr. Furnival had been very grievous to him, but he had borne with that, hoping that some word of eulogy from the judge would set him right in the public mind. But no such word had come, and poor John Kenneby felt that the cruel hard world was too much for him. He had been with his sister that morning, and words had dropped from him which made her fear that he would wish to postpone his marriage for another space of 10 years or so. "Brickfields," he had said. "What can such a one as I have to do with landed property? I am better as I am." Mrs. Smiley, however, did not at all seem to think so, and welcomed John Kenneby back from Alston very warmly, in spite of the disgrace to which he had been subjected. It was nothing to her that the judge had called her future lord a fool, nor indeed was it anything to any one but himself. According to Moulder's views it was a matter of course that a witness should be abused, for what other purpose was he had into the court? But deep in the mind of poor Kenneby himself the injurious words lay festering. He had struggled hard to tell the truth, and in doing so had simply proved himself to be an ass. "I ain't fit to live with anybody else but myself," he said to himself as he walked down to Bishopsgate Street. At this time Mrs. Smiley was not yet there. Bridget had arrived, and had been seated in a chair at one corner of the fire. Mrs. Moulder occupied one end of a sofa opposite, leaving the place of honour at the other end for Mrs. Smiley. Moulder sat immediately in front of the fire in his own easy chair, and Snengkeld and Kantwise were on each side of him. They were of course discussing the trial when Mrs. Smiley was announced, and it was well that she made a diversion by her arrival, for words were beginning to run high.
"A jury of her countrymen has found her innocent," Moulder had said with much heat, "and any one who says she's guilty after that is a libeller and a coward, to my way of thinking. If a jury of her countrymen don't make a woman innocent, what does?"
"Of course she's innocent," said Snengkeld, "from the very moment the words were spoken by the foreman. If any newspaper was to say she wasn't, she'd have her action." "That's all very well," said Kantwise, looking up to the ceiling with his eyes nearly shut, "but you'll see. What'll you bet me, Mr. Moulder, that Joseph Mason don't get the property?" "Gammon," answered Moulder. "Well, it may be gammon, but you'll see." "Gentlemen, gentlemen," said Mrs. Smiley, sailing into the room, "upon my word one hears all you say ever so far down the street." "And I didn't care if they heard it right away to the Mansion House," said Moulder. "We ain't talking treason, nor yet highway robbery." Then Mrs. Smiley was welcomed. Her bonnet was taken from her, and her umbrella, and she was encouraged to spread herself out over the sofa. "Oh, Mrs. Bolster, the witness," she said, when Mrs. Moulder went through some little ceremony of introduction, and from the tone of her voice it appeared that she was not quite satisfied that Mrs. Bolster should be there as a companion for herself. "Yes, ma'am, I was the witness as had never signed but once," said Bridget, getting up and curtsying. Then she sat down again, folding her hands one over the other on her lap. "Oh, indeed," said Mrs. Smiley. "But where's the other witness, Mrs. Moulder? He's the one who is a deal more interesting to me. But as you all know it here, what's the good of not telling the truth?" "John's here," said Mrs. Moulder. "Come, John, why don't you show yourself?" "He's just alive, and that's about all you can say for him," said Moulder. "Why, what's there been to kill him?" said Mrs. Smiley. "Well, John, I must say you're rather backward in coming forward, considering what there's been between us. You might have come and taken my shawl, I'm thinking." "Yes, I might," said Kenneby gloomily. "I hope I see you pretty well, Mrs. Smiley." "Pretty bobbish, thank you. only I think it might have been Maria between friends like us."
"He's sadly put about by this trial," whispered Mrs. Moulder. "You know he is so tender-hearted that he can't bear to be put upon like another."
"But you didn't want her to be found guilty, did you, John?"
"That I'm sure he didn't," said Moulder. "Why, it was the way he gave his evidence that brought her off."
"It wasn't my wish to bring her off," said Kenneby, "nor was it my wish to make her guilty. All I wanted was to tell the truth and do my duty, but it was no use. I believe it never is any use."
"I think you did very well," said Moulder.
"I'm sure Lady Mason ought to be very much obliged to you," said Kantwise. "Nobody needn't care for what's said to them in a court," said Snengkeld. "I remember when once they wanted to make out that I'd taken a parcel of teas."
"Stolen, you mean, sir?" suggested Mrs. Smiley.
"Yes, stolen; but it was only done by the opposite side in court, and I didn't think a ha'porth of it. They knew where the teas was well enough." "Speaking for myself," said Kenneby, "I must say I don't like it."
"But the paper as we signed," said Bridget, "wasn't the old gentleman's will, no more than this is," and she lifted up her apron. "I'm rightly sure of that."
Then again the battle raged hot and furious, and Moulder became angry with his guest, Bridget Bolster. Kantwise, finding himself supported in his views by the principal witness at the trial, took heart against the tyranny of Moulder, and expressed his opinion, while Mrs. Smiley, with a woman's customary dislike to another woman, sneered ill-naturedly at the idea of Lady Mason's innocence. Poor Kenneby had been forced to take the middle seat on the sofa between his bride and sister, but it did not appear that the honour of his position had any effect in lessening his gloom or mitigating the severity of the judgment which had been passed on him.
"Wasn't the old gentleman's will," said Moulder, turning on poor Bridget in his anger with a growl. "But I say it was the old gentleman's will. You never dared say as much as that in court."
"I wasn't asked," said Bridget.
"You weren't asked? Yes, you was asked often enough."
"I'll tell you what it is," said Kantwise. "Mrs. Bolster's right in what she says, as sure as your name's Moulder."
"Then as sure as my name's Moulder, she's wrong. I suppose we're to think that a chap like you knows more about it than the jury. We all know who your friend is in the matter. I haven't forgot our dinner at Leeds, nor shan't in a hurry."
"Now, John," said Mrs. Smiley, "nobody can know the truth of this so well as you do. You've been as close as wax, as was all right till the lady was out of her troubles. That's done and over, and let us hear among friends how the matter really was." And then there was silence among them in order that his words might come forth freely. "Come, my dear," said Mrs. Smiley, with a tone of encouraging love. "There can't be any harm now, can there?"
"Out with it, John," said Moulder. "You're honest, anyways."
"There ain't no gammon about you," said Snengkeld. "Mr. Kenneby can speak if he likes, no doubt," said Kantwise, "though maybe it mayn't be very pleasant to him to do so after all that's come and gone." "There's nothing that's come and gone that need make our John hold his tongue," said Mrs. Moulder. "He mayn't be just as bright as some of those lawyers, but he's a deal more true-hearted." "But he can't say as how it was the old gentleman's will as we signed. I'm well assured of that," said Bridget. But Kenneby, though thus called upon by the united strength of the company to solve all their doubts, still remained silent. "Come, lovey," said Mrs. Smiley, putting forth her hand and giving his arm a tender squeeze.
"If you've anything to say to clear that woman's character," said Moulder, "you owe it to society to say it, because she is a woman, and because her enemies is villains."
And then again there was silence while they waited for him. "I think it will go with him to his grave," said Mrs. Smiley very solemnly. "I shouldn't wonder," said Snengkeld.
"Then he must give up all idea of taking a wife," said Moulder. "He won't do that, I'm sure," said Mrs. Smiley. "That he won't, will you, John?" said his sister.
"There's no knowing what may happen to me in this world," said Kenneby, "but sometimes I almost think I ain't fit to live in it along with anybody else." "You'll make him fit, won't you, my dear?" said Mrs. Moulder. "I don't exactly know what to say about it," said Mrs. Smiley. If Mr. Kenneby ain't willing, I'm not the woman to bind him to his word, because I've had his promise over and over again, and could prove it by a number of witnesses before any jury in the land. I'm an independent woman as needn't be beholden to any man, and I should never think of damages. Smiley left me comfortable before all the world, and I don't know but what I'm a fool to think of changing. Anyways, if Mr. Kenneby—" "Come, John, why don't you speak to her?" said Mrs. Moulder. "And what am I to say?" said Kenneby, thrusting himself forth from between the ample folds of the two ladies' dresses. "I'm a blighted man, one on whom the finger of scorn has been pointed. His lordship said that I was stupid, and perhaps I am." "She don't think nothing of that, John." "Certainly not," said Mrs. Smiley. "As long as a man can pay 20 shillings in the pound, and a trifle over, what does it matter if all the judges in the land was to call him stupid?" said Snengkeld. "Stupid is as stupid does," said Kantwise. "Stupid be damned," said Moulder. "Mr. Moulder, there's ladies present," said Mrs. Smiley. "Come, John, rouse yourself a bit," said his sister. "Nobody here thinks the worse of you for what the judge said." "Certainly not," said Mrs. Smiley; "and as it becomes me to speak, I'll say my mind. I'm accustomed to speak freely before friends, and as we are all friends here, why should I be ashamed?" "For the matter of that, nobody says you are," said Moulder. "And I don't mean, Mr. Moulder, why should I? I can pay my way and do what I like with my own, and has people to mind me when I speak, and needn't mind nobody else myself. And that's more than everybody can say. Here's John Kenneby and I is engaged as man and wife. He won't say as it's not so, I'll be bound." "No," said Kenneby, "I'm engaged, I know." "When I accepted John Kenneby's hand and heart, and well I remember the beauteous language in which he expressed his feelings, and always shall, I told him that I respected him as a man that would do his duty by a woman, though perhaps he mightn't be so cute in the way of having much to say for himself as some others. 'What's the good,' said I, 'of a man's talking, if so be he's ashamed to meet the baker at the end of the week?' So I listened to the vows he made me, and have considered that he and I was as good as one. Now that he's been put upon by them lawyers, I'm not the woman to turn my back upon him." "That you're not," said Moulder. "No, I ain't, Mr. Moulder; and so, John, there's my hand again, and you're free to take it if you like." And so saying, she put forth her hand almost into his lap. "Take it, John," said Mrs. Moulder; but poor Kenneby himself did not seem to be very quick in availing himself of the happiness offered to him. He did raise his right arm slightly, but then he hesitated, and allowed it to fall again between him and his sister. "Come, John, you know you mean it," said Mrs. Moulder; and then with both her hands she lifted his and placed it bodily within the grasp of Mrs. Smiley's, which was still held forth to receive it. "I know I'm engaged," said Kenneby. "There's no mistake about it," said Moulder. "There needn't be none," said Mrs. Smiley, softly blushing; "and I will say this of myself, as I have been tempted to give a promise, I'm not the woman to go back from my word. There's my hand, John, and I don't care though all the world hears me say so." And then they sat hand in hand for some seconds, during which poor Kenneby was unable to escape from the grasp of his bride elect. One may say that all chance of final escape for him was now gone by. "But he can't say as how it was the old gentleman's will as we signed," said Bridget, breaking the silence which ensued. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," said Kantwise, "as Mrs. Bolster has come back to that matter, I'll tell you something that will surprise you. My friend Mr. Moulder here, who is as hospitable a gentleman as I know anywhere, wouldn't just let me speak before." "That's gammon, Kantwise. I never hindered you from speaking." "How I do hate that word! If you knew my aversion, Mr. Moulder." "I can't pick my words for you, old fellow." "But what were you going to tell us, Mr. Kantwise?" said Mrs. Smiley. "Something that will make all your hairs stand on end, I think." And then he paused and looked round upon them all. It was at this moment that Kenneby succeeded in getting his hand once more to himself. "Something that will surprise you all, or I'm very much mistaken. Lady Mason has confessed her guilt." He had surprised them all. "You don't say so!" exclaimed Mrs. Moulder. "Confessed her guilt!" said Mrs. Smiley. "But what guilt, Mr. Kantwise?" "She forged the will," said Kantwise. "I knew that all along," said Bridget Bolster. "I'm damned if I believe it," said Moulder. "You can do as you like about that," said Kantwise. "But she has, and I'll tell you what's more. She and young Mason have already left Orley Farm and given it all up into Joseph Mason's hands." "But didn't she get a verdict?" asked Snengkeld. "Yes, she got a verdict. There's no doubt on earth about that." "Then it's my opinion she can't make herself guilty if she wished it. And as for the property, she can't give it up. The jury has found a verdict, and nobody can go beyond that. If anybody tries, she'll have her action against 'em." That was the law as laid down by Snengkeld. "I don't believe a word of it," said Moulder. "Dockwrath has told him. I'll bet a hat that Kantwise got it from Dockwrath." It turned out that Kantwise had received his information from Dockwrath, but nevertheless there was that in his manner and in the nature of the story as it was told to them that did produce belief. Moulder for a long time held out, but it became clear at last that even he was shaken. And now even Kenneby acknowledged his conviction that the signature to the will was not his own. "I knowed very well that I never did it twice," said Bridget Bolster triumphantly, as she sat down to the supper table. I am inclined to think that upon the whole the company in Great St. Helens became more happy as the conviction grew upon them that a great and mysterious crime had been committed which had baffled 2 courts of law, and had at last thrust itself forth into the open daylight through the workings of the criminal's conscience. When Kantwise had completed his story, the time had come in which it behoved Mrs. Moulder to descend to the lower regions and give some aid in preparation of the supper. During her absence the matter was discussed in every way, and on her return, when she was laden with good things, she found that all the party was contented except Moulder and her brother. "It's a very terrible thing," said Mrs. Smiley later in the evening, as she sat with her steaming glass of rum and water before her. "Very terrible indeed, ain't it, John? I do wish now I'd gone down and seed her. I do indeed. Don't you, Mrs. Moulder? If all this is true, I should like just to have had a peep at her. At any rate, we shall have pictures of her in all the papers," said Mrs. Smiley.
End of Chapter 77 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 78 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 78. The Last of the Lawyers. "I should have done my duty by you, Mr. Mason, which those men have not, and you would at this moment have been the owner of Orley Farm." It will easily be known that these words were spoken by Mr. Dockwrath, and that they were addressed to Joseph Mason. The 2 men were seated together in Mr. Mason's lodgings at Alston, late on the morning after the verdict had been given, and Mr. Dockwrath was speaking out his mind with sufficient freedom. On the previous evening he had been content to put up with the misery of the unsuccessful man, and had not added any reproaches of his own. He also had been cowed by the verdict, and the 2 had been wretched and crestfallen together. But the attorney, since that, had slept upon the matter, and had bethought himself that he at any rate would make out his little bill. He could show that Mr. Mason had ruined their joint affairs by his adherence to those London attorneys. Had Mr. Mason listened to the advice of his new adviser, all would have been well. So at least Dockwrath was prepared to declare, finding that by so doing he would best pave the way for his own important claim. But Mr. Mason was not a man to be bullied with tame endurance. "The firm bears the highest name in the profession, sir," he said, "and I had just grounds for trusting them.
"And what has come of your just grounds, Mr. Mason? Where are you? That's the question. I say that Round and Crook have thrown you over. They have been hand and glove with old Furnival through the whole transaction. And I'll tell you what's more, Mr. Mason, I told you how it would be from the beginning. I'll move for a new trial." "A new trial, and this a criminal prosecution?" "She's free of you now for ever, and Orley Farm will belong to that son of hers till he chooses to sell it. It's a pity, that's all. I did my duty by you in a professional way, Mr. Mason, and you won't put the loss on my shoulders." "I've been robbed, damnably robbed. That's all that I know." "There's no mistake on earth about that, Mr. Mason. You have been robbed, and the worst of it is the costs will be so heavy. You'll be going down to Yorkshire soon, I suppose, sir?" "I don't know where I shall go," said the Squire of Groby, not content to be cross-questioned by the attorney from Hamworth. "Because it's as well, I suppose, that we should settle something about the costs before you leave. I don't want to press for my money exactly now, but I shall be glad to know when I'm to get it." "If you have any claim on me, Mr. Dockwrath, you can send it to Mr. Round." "If I have any claim! What do you mean by that, sir? And I shall send nothing in to Mr. Round. I have had quite enough of Mr. Round already. I told you from the beginning, Mr. Mason, that I would have nothing to do with this affair as connected with Mr. Round. I have devoted myself entirely to this matter since you were pleased to engage my services at Groby Park. It is not my fault that you have failed. I think, Mr. Mason, you will do me the justice to acknowledge that." And then Dockwrath was silent for a moment, as though waiting for an answer. "I have nothing to say upon the subject, Mr. Dockwrath," said Mason. "But, by heaven, something must be said. That won't do at all, Mr. Mason. I presume you do not think that I have been working like a slave for the last 4 months for nothing?" Mr. Mason was in truth an honest man, and did not wish that any one should work on his account for nothing. Much less did he wish that such a one as Dockwrath should do so. But then, on the other side, in his present frame of mind, he was by no means willing to yield anything to any one. "I neither deny nor allow your claim, Mr. Dockwrath," said he, "but I shall pay nothing except through my regular lawyers. You can send your account to me if you please, but I shall send it on to Mr. Round without looking at it." "Oh, that's to be the way, is it? That's your gratitude. Very well, Mr. Mason. I shall now know what to do, and I think you'll find—" Here Mr. Dockwrath was interrupted by the lodging house servant, who brought in a note for Mr. Mason. It was from Mr. Furnival, and the girl who delivered it said that the gentleman's messenger was waiting for an answer. "Sir," said the note, "a communication has been made to me this morning on the part of your brother, Mr. Lucius Mason, which may make it desirable that I should have an interview with you. If not inconvenient to you, I would ask you to meet me to morrow morning at 11 o'clock at the chambers of your own lawyer, Mr. Round, in Bedford Row. I have already seen Mr. Round, and find that he can meet us. I am, sir, your very obedient servant, Thomas Furnival. J. Mason, Esquire, J.P. of Groby Park. Mr. Furnival, when he wrote this note, had already been over to Orley Farm, and had seen Lucius Mason. He had been at the farm almost before daylight, and had come away with the assured conviction that the property must be abandoned by his client. "We need not talk about it, Mr. Furnival," Lucius had said. "It must be so." "You have discussed the matter with your mother?" "No discussion is necessary, but she is quite aware of my intention. She is prepared to leave the place for ever." "But the income—" "Belongs to my brother Joseph. Mr. Furnival, I think you may understand that the matter is one in which it is necessary that I should act, but as to which I trust I may not have to say many words. If you cannot arrange this for me, I must go to Mr. Round." Of course Mr. Furnival did understand it all. His client had been acquitted, and he had triumphed, but he had known for many a long day that the estate did belong of right to Mr. Mason of Groby; and though he had not suspected that Lucius would have been so told, he could not be surprised at the result of such telling. It was clear to him that Lady Mason had confessed, and that restitution would therefore be made. "I will do your bidding," said he. "And, Mr. Furnival, if it be possible, spare my mother." Then the meeting was over, and Mr. Furnival, returning to Hamworth, wrote his note to Mr. Joseph Mason. Mr. Dockwrath had been interrupted by the messenger in the middle of his threat, but he caught the name of Furnival as the note was delivered. Then he watched Mr. Mason as he read it, and read it again. "If you please, sir, I was to wait for an answer," said the girl. Mr. Mason did not know what answer it would behoove him to give. He felt that he was among Philistines while dealing with all these lawyers, and yet he was at a loss in what way to reply to one without leaning upon another. "Look at that," he said, sulkily handing the note to Dockwrath. "You must see Mr. Furnival by all means," said Dockwrath, "but—" "But what?" "In your place I should not see him in the presence of Mr. Round, unless I was attended by an adviser on whom I could rely." Mr. Mason, having given a few moments' consideration to the matter, sat himself down and wrote a line to Mr. Furnival, saying that he would be in Bedford Row at the appointed time. "I think you are quite right," said Dockwrath. "But I shall go alone," said Mr. Mason. "Oh, very well. You will of course judge for yourself. I cannot say what may be the nature of the communication to be made, but if it be anything touching the property, you will no doubt jeopardize your own interests by your imprudence." "Good morning, Mr. Dockwrath," said Mr. Mason. "Oh, very well. Good morning, sir. You shall hear from me very shortly, Mr. Mason, and I must say that, considering everything, I do not know that I ever came across a gentleman who behaved himself worse in a peculiar position than you have done in yours." And so they parted. Punctually at 11 o'clock on the following day Mr. Mason was in Bedford Row. "Mr. Furnival is with Mr. Round," said the clerk, "and will see you in 2 minutes." Then he was shown into the dingy office waiting room, where he sat with his hat in his hand for rather more than 2 minutes. At that moment Mr. Round was describing to Mr. Furnival the manner in which he had been visited some weeks since by Sir Peregrine Orme. "Of course, Mr. Furnival, I knew which way the wind blew when I heard that." "She must have told him everything." "No doubt, no doubt. At any rate he knew it all." "And what did you say to him?" "I promised to hold my tongue, and I kept my promise. Mat knows nothing about it to this day." The whole history thus became gradually clear to Mr. Furnival's mind, and he could understand in what manner that marriage had been avoided. Mr. Round also understood it, and the two lawyers confessed together that though the woman had deserved the punishment which had come upon her, her character was one which might have graced a better destiny. "And now I suppose my fortunate client may come in," said Mr. Round. Whereupon the fortunate client was released from his captivity and brought into the sitting room of the senior partner. "Mr. Mason, Mr. Furnival," said the attorney, as soon as he had shaken hands with his client. "You know each other very well by name, gentlemen." Mr. Mason was very stiff in his bearing and demeanour, but remarked that he had heard of Mr. Furnival before. "All the world has heard of him," said Mr. Round. "He hasn't hid his light under a bushel." Whereupon Mr. Mason bowed, not quite understanding what was said to him. "Mr. Mason," began the barrister, "I have a communication to make to you very singular in its nature, and of great importance. It is one which I believe you will regard as being of considerable importance to yourself, and which is of still higher moment to my friend, Lady Mason." "Lady Mason, sir," began the other, but Mr. Furnival stopped him. "Allow me to interrupt you, Mr. Mason. I think it will be better that you should hear me before you commit yourself to any expression as to your relative." "She is no relative of mine." "But her son is. However, if you will allow me, I will go on. Having this communication to make, I thought it expedient for your own sake that it should be done in the presence of your own legal adviser and friend." grunted the disappointed litigant. "I have already explained to Mr. Round that which I am about to explain to you, and he was good enough to express himself as satisfied with the step which I am taking." "Quite so, Mr. Mason.
Mr. Furnival is behaving, and I believe has behaved throughout, in a manner becoming the very high position which he holds in his profession." "I suppose he has done his best on his side," said Mason. "Undoubtedly I have, as I should have done on yours had it so chanced that I had been honoured by holding a brief from your attorneys. But the communication which I am going to make now I make not as a lawyer, but as a friend. Mr. Mason, my client Lady Mason, and her son Lucius Mason are prepared to make over to you the full possession of the estate which they have held under the name of Orley Farm." The tidings as so given were far from conveying to the sense of the hearer the full information which they bore. He heard the words, and at the moment conceived that Orley Farm was intended to come into his hands by some process to which it was thought desirable that he should be brought to agree. He was to be induced to buy it, or to be bought over from further opposition by some concession of an indefinitely future title. But that the estate was to become his at once, without purchase, and by the mere free will of his hated relatives, was an idea that he did not realize. "Mr. Furnival," he said, "what future steps I shall take I do not yet know. That I have been robbed of my property I am as firmly convinced now as ever. But I tell you fairly, and I tell Mr. Round so too, that I will have no dealings with that woman." "Your father's widow, sir," said Mr. Furnival, "is an unhappy lady who is now doing her best to atone for the only fault of which I believe her to have been guilty. If you were not unreasonable as well as angry, you would understand that the proposition which I am now making to you is one which should force you to forgive any injury which she may hitherto have done to you. Your half brother, Lucius Mason, has instructed me to make over to you the possession of Orley Farm." These last words Mr. Furnival uttered very slowly, fixing his keen grey eyes full upon the face of Joseph Mason as he did so, and then turning round to the attorney he said, "I presume your client will understand me now." "The estate is yours, Mr. Mason," said Round. "You have nothing to do but to take possession of it." "What do you mean?" said Mason, turning round upon Furnival. "Exactly what I say. Your half brother Lucius surrenders to you the estate." "Without payment?" "Yes, without payment. On his doing so, you will of course absolve him from all liability on account of the proceeds of the property while in his hands." "That will be a matter of course," said Mr. Round. "Then she has robbed me," said Mason, jumping up to his feet. "By God, the will was forged after all." "Mr. Mason," said Mr. Round, "if you have a spark of generosity in you, you will accept the offer made to you without asking any question. By no such questioning can you do yourself any good, nor can you do that poor lady any harm." "I knew it was so," he said loudly, and as he spoke he twice walked the length of the room. "I knew it was so. 20 years ago I said the same. She forged the will. I ask you as my lawyer, Mr. Round, did she not forge the will herself?" "I shall answer no such question, Mr. Mason." "Then by heavens I'll expose you. If I spend the whole value of the estate in doing it, I'll expose you, and have her punished yet. The slippery villain! For 20 years she has robbed me." "Mr. Mason, you are forgetting yourself in your passion," said Mr. Furnival. "What you have to look for now is the recovery of the property." But here Mr. Furnival showed that he had not made himself master of Joseph Mason's character. "No," shouted the angry man. "No, by heaven! What I have first to look to is her punishment, and that of those who have assisted her. I knew she had done it, and Dockwrath knew it. Had I trusted him she would now have been in gaol." Mr. Furnival and Mr. Round were both desirous of having the matter quietly arranged, and with this view were willing to put up with much. The man had been ill used. When he declared for the 40th time that he had been robbed for 20 years, they could not deny it. When with horrid oath he swore that that will had been a forgery, they could not contradict him. When he reviled the laws of his country, which had done so much to facilitate the escape of a criminal, they had no arguments to prove that he was wrong. They bore with him in his rage,
hoping that a sense of his own self-interest might induce him to listen to reason. But it was all in vain. The property was sweet, but that sweetness was tasteless when compared to the sweetness of revenge.
"Nothing shall make me tamper with justice, nothing," said he.
"But even if it were as you say, you cannot do anything to her," said Round.
"I'll try," said Mason. "You have been my attorney, and what you know in the matter you are bound to tell. And I'll make you tell, sir."
"Upon my word," said Round, "this is beyond bearing. Mr. Mason, I must trouble you to walk out of my office." And then he rang the bell. "Tell Mr. Mat I want to see him." But before that younger partner had joined his father, Joseph Mason had gone.
"Mat," said the old man, "I don't interfere with you in many things, but on this I must insist. As long as my name is in the firm, Mr. Joseph Mason of Groby shall not be among our customers."
"The man's a fool," said Mr. Furnival. "The end of all that will be that 2 years will go by before he gets his property, and in the meantime the house and all about it will go to ruin." In these days there was a delightful family concord between Mr. Furnival and his wife, and perhaps we may be allowed to hope that the peace was permanent. Martha Biggs had not been in Harley Street since we last saw her there, and was now walking round Red Lion Square by the hour, with some kindred spirit complaining bitterly of the return which had been made for her friendship.
"What I endured and what I was prepared to endure for that woman, no breathing creature can ever know," said Martha Biggs to that other Martha. "And now—" "I suppose the fact is he don't like to see you there," said the other. "And is that a reason?" said our Martha. "Had I been in her place I would not have put my foot in his house again till I was assured that my friend should be as welcome there as myself. But then, perhaps, my ideas of friendship may be called romantic."
But though there were heart-burnings and war in Red Lion Square, there was sweet peace in Harley Street. Mrs. Furnival had learned that beyond all doubt Lady Mason was an unfortunate woman on whose behalf her husband was using his best energies as a lawyer, and though rumours had begun to reach her that were very injurious to the lady's character, she did not on that account feel animosity against her. Had Lady Mason been guilty of all the sins in the calendar except one, Mrs. Furnival could find it within her heart to forgive her. But Sophia was now more interested about Lady Mason than was her mother, and during those days of the trial was much more eager to learn the news as it became known. She had said nothing to her mother about Lucius, nor had she said anything as to Augustus Staveley. Miss Furnival was a lady who on such subjects did not want the assistance of a mother's counsel. Then, early on the morning that followed the trial, they heard the verdict, and knew that Lady Mason was free. "I am so glad," said Mrs. Furnival, "and I am sure it was your papa's doing." "But we will hope that she was really innocent," said Sophia. "Oh yes, of course, and so I suppose she was. I am sure I hope so. But nevertheless we all know that it was going very much against her." "I believe papa never thought she was guilty for a moment." "I don't know, my dear. Your papa never talks of the clients for whom he is engaged. But what a thing it is for Lucius! He would have lost every acre of the property." "Yes, it's a great thing for him, certainly." And then she began to consider whether the standing held by Lucius Mason in the world was not even yet somewhat precarious. It was on the same day, in the evening, that she received her lover's letter. She was alone when she read it, and she made herself quite master of its contents before she sat herself to think in what way it would be expedient that she should act. "I am bound to relinquish to my brother-in-law my title to Orley Farm." Why should he be so bound, unless? And then she also came to that conclusion which Mr. Round had reached, and which Joseph Mason had reached, when they heard that the property was to be given up. "Yes, Sophia, I am a beggar," the letter went on to say. She was very sorry, deeply sorry. So at least she said to herself, As she sat there alone she took out her handkerchief and pressed it to her eyes. Then, having restored it to her pocket, after moderate use, she refolded her letter and put that into the same receptacle. "Papa," she said that evening, "what will Mr. Lucius Mason do now? Will he remain at Orley Farm?" "No, my dear. He will leave Orley Farm, and I think will go abroad with his mother." "And who will have Orley Farm?" "His brother Joseph, I believe." "And what will Lucius have?" "I cannot say. I do not know that he will have anything. His mother has an income of her own, and he, I suppose, will go into some profession." "Oh, indeed. Is not that very sad for him, poor fellow?" In answer to which her father made no remark. That night in her room she answered her lover's letter, and her answer was as follows: Harley Street, March, 18 . My dear Mr. Mason, I need hardly tell you that I was grieved to the heart by the tidings conveyed in your letter. I will not ask you for that secret which you withhold from me, feeling that I have no title to inquire into it. Nor will I attempt to guess at the cause which induces you to give up to your brother the property which you were always taught to regard as your own. That you are actuated by noble motives I am sure, and you may be sure of this, that I shall respect you quite as highly in your adversity as I have ever done in your prosperity. That you will make your way in the world I shall never doubt, and it may be that the labour which you will now encounter will raise you to higher standing than any you could have achieved had the property remained in your possession. I think you are right in saying, with reference to our mutual regard for each other, that neither should be held as having any claim upon the other. Under present circumstances any such claim would be very silly. Nothing would hamper you in your future career so much as a long marriage engagement, and for myself I am aware that the sorrow and solicitude thence arising would be more than I could support. Apart from this also I feel certain that I should never obtain my father's sanction for such an engagement, nor could I make it unless he sanctioned it. I feel so satisfied that you will see the truth of this, that I need not trouble you and harass my own heart by pursuing the subject any further. My feelings of friendship for you, of affectionate friendship, will be as true as ever. I shall look to your future career with great hope, and shall hear of your success with the utmost satisfaction. And I trust that the time may come, at no very distant date, when we may all welcome your return to London, and show you that our regard for you has never been diminished. May God bless and preserve you in the trials which are before you, and carry you through them with honour and safety. Wherever you may be, I shall watch for tidings of you with anxiety, and always hear them with gratification. I need hardly bid you remember that you have no more affectionate friend than yours always, most sincerely, Sophia Furnival. P.S. I believe that a meeting between us at the present moment would only cause pain to both of us. It might drive you to speak of things which should be wrapped in silence. At any rate, I am sure that you will not press it on me. Lucius, when he received this letter, was living with his mother in lodgings near Finsbury Circus, and the letter had been redirected from Hamworth to a post office in that neighbourhood. It was his intention to take his mother with him to a small town on one of the rivers that feed the Rhine, and there remain hidden till he could find some means by which he might earn his bread. He was sitting with her in the evening, with 2 dull tallow candles on the table between them, when his messenger brought the letter to him. He read it in silence very deliberately, then crushed it in his hand and threw it from him with violence into the fire. "I hope there is nothing further to distress you, Lucius," said his mother, looking up into his face as though she were imploring his confidence. "No, nothing. Nothing that matters. It is an affair quite private to myself." Sir Peregrine had spoken with great truth when he declared that Lucius Mason was able to bear adversity. This last blow had now come upon him, but he made no wailings as to his misery, nor did he say a word further on the subject. His mother watched the paper as the flame caught it and reduced it to an ash, but she asked no further question. She knew that her position with him did not permit of her asking or even hoping for his confidence. "I had no right to expect it would be otherwise," he said to himself; but even to himself he spoke no word of reproach against Miss Furnival. He had realized the circumstances by which he was surrounded, and had made up his mind to bear their result. As for Miss Furnival, we may as well declare here that she did not become Mrs. Stavely. Our old friend Augustus conceived that he had received a sufficient answer on the occasion of his last visit to Harley Street, and did not repeat it immediately. Such little scenes as that which took place there had not been uncommon in his life, and when in after months he looked back upon the affair, he counted it up as one of those miraculous escapes which had marked his career. End of Chapter 78 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 79 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 79. Farewell. "That letter you got this morning, my dear, was it not from Lady Mason?" "It was from Lady Mason, father. They go on Thursday." "On Thursday? So soon as that?" And then Sir Peregrine, who had asked the question, remained silent for a while. The letter, according to the family custom, had been handed to Mrs. Orme over the breakfast table, but he had made no remark respecting it till they were alone together and free from the servants. It had been a farewell letter, full of love and gratitude, and full also of repentance. Lady Mason had now been for 3 weeks in London, and once during that time Mrs. Orme had gone up to visit her. She had then remained with her friend for hours, greatly to Lady Mason's comfort. And now this letter had come, bringing a last adieu. "You may read it, sir, if you like," said Mrs. Orme, handing him the letter. It was evident by his face that he was gratified by the privilege, and he read it not once only, but over and over again. As he did so he placed himself in the shade, and sat with his back to Mrs. Orme; but nevertheless she could see that from time to time he rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, and gradually raised his handkerchief to his face. "Thank you, dearest," he said, as he gave the letter back to her. "I think that we may forgive her now even all that she has done," said Mrs. Orme. "Yes, yes, yes," he answered. "For myself, I forgave her from the first." "I know you did. But as regards the property, it has been given up now." And then again they were silent. "Edith," he said after a while, "I have forgiven her altogether. To me she is the same as though she had never done that deed. Are we not all sinners?" "Surely, father." "And can I say because she did one startling thing that the total of her sin is greater than mine? Was I ever tempted as she was tempted? Was my youth made dangerous for me as was hers? And then she did nothing for herself. She did it all for another. We may think of that now." "I have thought of it always." "It did not make the sin the less, but among her fellow mortals." And then he stopped himself, wanting words to express his meaning. The sin, till it was repented, was damning; but now that it was repented, he could almost love the sinner for the sin. "Edith," he said again. And he looked at her so wishfully. She knew well what was the working of his heart, and she knew also that she did not dare to encourage him. "I trust," said Mrs. Orme, "that she will bear her present lot for a few years, and then perhaps—" "Ah, then I shall be in my grave. A few months will do that." "Oh, sir!"
Why should I not save her from such a life as that?" "From that which she had most to fear she has been saved." "Had she not so chosen it herself, she could now have demanded from me a home. Why should I not give it to her now?" "A home here, sir?" "Yes, why not? But I know what you would say. It would be wrong to you and Perry." "It would be wrong to yourself, sir. Think of it, father. It is the fact that she did that thing. We may forgive her, but others will not do so on that account. It would not be right that you should bring her here." Sir Peregrine knew that it would not be right. Though he was old and weak in body and infirm in purpose, his judgment had not altogether left him. He was well aware that he would offend all social laws if he were to do that which he contemplated, and ask the world around him to respect as Lady Orme, as his wife, the woman who had so deeply disgraced herself. But yet he could hardly bring himself to confess that it was impossible. He was as a child who knows that a coveted treasure is beyond his reach, but still covets it, still longs for it, hoping against hope that it may yet be his own. It seemed to him that he might yet regain his old vitality if he could wind his arm once more about her waist and press her to his side and call her his own. It would be so sweet to forgive her, to make her sure that she was absolutely forgiven, to teach her that there was one at least who would not bring up against her her past sin, even in his memory. As for his grandson, the property should be abandoned to him altogether. 'Twas thus he argued with himself; but yet, as he argued, he knew that it could not be so. "I was harsh to her when she told me," he said, after another pause. "Cruelly harsh." "She does not think so." "No, if I had spurned her from me with my foot she would not have thought so. She had condemned herself, and therefore I should have spared her." "But you did spare her. I am sure she feels that from the first to the last your conduct to her has been more than kind." "And I owed her more than kindness, for I loved her. Yes, I loved her, and I do love her. Though I am a feeble old man tottering to my grave, yet I love her. Love her as that boy loves the fair girl for whom he longs. He will overcome it and forget it, and some other one as fair will take her place. But for me it is all over." What could she say to him? In truth it was all over, such love at least as that of which his old heart was dreaming in its dotage. There is no Medea's cauldron from which our limbs can come out young and fresh, and it were well that the heart should grow old as does the body. "It is not all over while we are with you," she said, caressing him; but she knew that what she said was a subterfuge. "Yes, yes, I have you, dearest," he answered; but he also knew that that pretence at comfort was false and hollow. "And she starts on Thursday," he said, "on next Thursday." "Yes, on Thursday. It will be much better for her to be away from London. While she is there she never ventures even into the street." "Edith, I shall see her before she goes." "Will that be wise, sir?" "Perhaps not. It may be foolish, very foolish, but still I shall see her. I think you forget, Edith, that I have never yet bidden her farewell. I have not spoken to her since that day when she behaved so generously." "I do not think that she expects it, father." "No, she expects nothing for herself. Had it been in her nature to expect such a visit, I should not have been anxious to make it. I will go to morrow. She is always at home, you say?" "Yes, she is always at home." "And Lucius?" "You will not find him there in the daytime." I shall go to morrow, dear. You need not tell Peregrine."
Mrs. Orme still thought that he was wrong, but she had nothing further to say. She could not hinder his going, and therefore, with his permission, she wrote a line to Lady Mason, telling her of his purpose. And then, with all the care in her power, and with infinite softness of manner, she warned him against the danger which she so much feared. What might be the result if, overcome by tenderness, he should again ask Lady Mason to become his wife? Mrs. Orme firmly believed that Lady Mason would again refuse, but nevertheless there would be danger.
"No," said he, "I will not do that. When I have said so, you may accept my word."
Then she hastened to apologize to him, but he assured her with a kiss that he was in no wise angry with her. He held by his purpose, and on the following day he went up to London. There was nothing said on the matter at breakfast, nor did she make any further endeavour to dissuade him. He was infirm, but still she knew that the actual fatigue would not be of a nature to injure him. Indeed, her fear respecting him was rather in regard to his staying at home than to his going abroad. It would have been well for him could he have been induced to think himself fit for more active movement. Lady Mason was alone when he reached the dingy little room near Finsbury Circus, and received him standing. She was the first to speak, and this she did before she had even touched his hand. She stood to meet him with her eyes turned to the ground, and her hands tightly folded together before her. "Sir Peregrine," she said, "I did not expect from you this mark of your kindness."
"Of my esteem and affection, Lady Mason," he said. "We have known each other too well to allow of our parting without a word. I am an old man, and it will probably be for ever."
Then she gave him her hand and gradually lifted her eyes to his face. "Yes," she said, "it will be for ever. There will be no coming back for me."
"Nay, nay, we will not say that. That's as may be hereafter. But it will not be at once. It had better not be quite at once. Edith tells me that you go on Thursday."
"Yes, sir, we go on Thursday." She had still allowed her hand to remain in his, but now she withdrew it, and asked him to sit down. "Lucius is not here," she said. "He never remains at home after breakfast. He has much to settle as to our journey, and then he has his lawyers to see." Sir Peregrine had not at all wished to see Lucius Mason, but he did not say so.
"You will give him my regards," he said, "and tell him that I trust that he may prosper."
"Thank you, I will do so. It is very kind of you to think of him."
"I have always thought highly of him as an excellent young man."
"And he is excellent. Where is there any one who could suffer without a word as he suffers? No complaint ever comes from him. And yet I have ruined him."
"No, no. He has his youth, his intellect, and his education. If such a one as he cannot earn his bread in the world, ay, and more than his bread, who can do so? Nothing ruins a young man but ignorance, idleness, and depravity."
"Nothing, unless those of whom he should be proud disgrace him before the eyes of the world. Sir Peregrine, I sometimes wonder at my own calmness. I wonder that I can live. But believe me that never for a moment do I forget what I have done. I would have poured out for him my blood like water, if it would have served him. But instead of that, I have given him cause to curse me till the day of his death. Though I still live and eat and sleep, I think of that always. The remembrance is never away from me. They bid those who repent put on sackcloth and cover themselves with ashes. That is my sackcloth, and it is very sore. Those thoughts are ashes to me, and they are very bitter between my teeth." He did not know with what words to comfort her. It all was as she said, and he could not bid her even try to free herself from that sackcloth and from those ashes. It must be so. Were it not so with her, she would not have been in any degree worthy of that love which he felt for her. "God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb," he said. "Yes," she said, "for the shorn lamb." And then she was silent again. But could that bitter biting wind be tempered for the she wolf who in the dead of night had broken into the fold, and with prowling steps and cunning clutch had stolen the fodder from the sheep? That was the question as it presented itself to her. But she sat silent, and refrained from putting it into words. She sat silent, but he read her heart. "For the shorn lamb," she had said, and he had known her thoughts as they followed quick, one upon another, through her mind. "Mary," he said, seating himself now close beside her on the sofa, "if his heart be as true to you as mine, he will never remember these things against you." "It is my memory, not his, that is my punishment," she said. Why could he not take her home with him, and comfort her, and heal that festering wound, and stop that ever running gush of her heart's blood? But he could not. He had pledged his word and pawned his honour. All the comfort that could be his to bestow must be given in those few minutes that remained to him in that room. And it must be given, too, without falsehood. He could not bring himself to tell her that the sackcloth need not be sore to her poor lacerated body, nor the ashes bitter between her teeth. He could not tell her that the cup of which it was hers to drink might yet be pleasant to the taste and cool to the lips. What could he tell her? Of the only source of true comfort others, he knew, had spoken, others who had not spoken in vain. He could not now take up that matter and press it on her with available strength. For him there was but one thing to say. He had forgiven her. He still loved her. He would have cherished her in his bosom had it been possible. He was a weak, old, foolish man, and there was nothing of which he could speak but of his own heart. "Mary," he said, again taking her hand, I wish that I could comfort you." "And yet on you also have I brought trouble and misery, and all but disgrace." "No, my love, no; neither misery nor disgrace, except this misery, that I shall be no longer near to you. Yes, I will tell you all now. Were I alone in the world, I would still beg you to go back with me." "It cannot be. It could not possibly be so." "No, for I am not alone. She who loves you so well has told me so. It must not be. But that is the source of my misery. I have learned to love you too well, and do not know how to part with you. If this had not been so, I would have done all that an old man might to comfort you." "But it has been so," she said. "I cannot wash out the past. Knowing what I did of myself, Sir Peregrine, I should never have put my foot over your threshold." "I wish I might hear its step again upon my floors. I wish I might hear that light step once again." "Never, Sir Peregrine. No one again ever shall rejoice to hear either my step or my voice, or to see my form, or to grasp my hand. The world is over for me, and may God soon grant me relief from my sorrow. But to you, in return for your goodness—" "For my love." "In return for your love, what am I to say? I could have loved you with all my heart had it been so permitted. Nay, I did do so. Had that dream been carried out, I should not have sworn falsely when I gave you my hand. I bade her tell you so from me when I parted with her." "She did tell me." "I have known but little love. He, Sir Joseph, was my master rather than my husband. He was a good master, and I served him truly, except in that one thing. But I never loved him. But I am wrong to talk of this, and I will not talk of it longer. May God bless you, Sir Peregrine. It will be well for both of us now that you should leave me. May God bless you, Mary, and preserve you, and give back to you the comforts of a quiet spirit and a heart at rest. Till you hear that I am under the ground, you will know that there is one living who loves you well. Then he took her in his arms, twice kissed her on the forehead, and left the room without further speech on either side. Lady Mason, as soon as she was alone, sat herself down, and her thoughts ran back over the whole course of her life. Early in her days, when the world was yet beginning to her, she had done one evil deed, and from that time up to those days of her trial she had been the victim of one incessant struggle to appear before the world as though that deed had not been done, to appear innocent of it before the world, but beyond all things innocent of it before her son. For 20 years she had striven with a labour that had been all but unendurable, and now she had failed, and every one knew her for what she was. Such had been her life. And then she thought of the life which might have been hers. In her earlier days she had known what it was to be poor, and had seen and heard those battles over money which harden our hearts and quench the poetry of our natures. But it had not been altogether so with her. Had things gone differently with her, it might afterwards have been said that she had gone through the fire unscathed. But the beast had set his foot upon her, and when the temptation came, it was too much for her. Not for herself would she have sinned, or have robbed that old man, who had been to her a kind master. But when a child was born to her, her eyes were blind, and she could not see that wealth ill-gotten for her child would be as sure a curse as wealth ill-gotten for herself. She remembered Rebekah, and with the cunning of a second Rebekah she filched a world's blessing for her baby. Now she thought of all this as pictures of that life which might have been hers passed before her mind's eye. And they were pleasant pictures, had they not burnt into her very soul as she looked at them. How sweet had been that drawing-room at The Cleeve, as she sat there in luxurious quiet with her new friend! How sweet had been that friendship with a woman pure in all her thoughts, graceful to the eye, and delicate in all her ways! She knew now, as she thought of this, that to her had been given the power to appreciate such delights as these. How full of charm to her would have been that life, in which there had been so much of true innocent affection, had the load ever been absent from her shoulders. And then she thought of Sir Peregrine, with his pleasant ancient manner and truth of heart, and told herself that she could have been happy with the love of even so old a man as that, had that burden been away from her. But the burden had never been away, never could be away. Then she thought once more of her stern but just son, and as she bowed her head and kissed the rod, she prayed that her release might come to her soon. And now we will say farewell to her, and as we do so the chief interest of our tale will end. I may perhaps be thought to owe an apology to my readers in that I have asked their sympathy for a woman who had so sinned as to have placed her beyond the general sympathy of the world at large. If so, I tender my apology, and perhaps feel that I should confess a fault. But as I have told her story, that sympathy has grown upon myself till I have learned to forgive her, and to feel that I too could have regarded her as a friend. Of her future life I will not venture to say anything. But no lesson is truer than that which teaches us to believe that God does temper the wind to the shorn lamb. To how many has it not seemed at some one period of their lives that all was over for them, and that to them in their afflictions there was nothing left but to die? And yet they have lived to laugh again, to feel that the air was warm and the earth fair, and that God, in giving them ever-springing hope, had given everything. How many a sun may seem to set on an endless night, and yet rising again on some morrow, he tricks his beams, and with new-spangled ore flames in the forehead of the morning sky. For Lady Mason, let us hope that the day will come in which she also may once again trick her beams in some modest, unassuming way, and that for her the morning may even yet be sweet with a glad warmth. For us, here in these pages, it must be sufficient to say this last kindly farewell. As to Lucius Mason and the arrangement of his affairs with his stepbrother, a very few concluding words will suffice. When Joseph Mason left the office of Messrs. Round and Crook, he would gladly have sacrificed all hope of any eventual pecuniary benefit from the possession of Orley Farm, could he by doing so have secured the condign punishment of her who had so long kept him out of his inheritance. But he soon found that he had no means of doing this. In the first place, he did not know where to turn for advice. He had quarrelled absolutely with Dockwrath, and though he now greatly distrusted the Rounds, he by no means put implicit trust in him of Hamworth. Of the Rounds he suspected that they were engaged to serve his enemy. Of Dockwrath he felt sure that he was anxious only to serve himself. Under these circumstances he was driven into the arms of a third attorney, and learned from him, after a delay that cut him to the soul, that he could take no further criminal proceeding against Lady Mason. It would be impossible to have her even indicted for the forgery, seeing that 2 juries, at the interval of 20 years, had virtually acquitted her, unless new evidence which should be absolute and positive in its kind should be forthcoming. But there was no new evidence of any kind. The offer made to surrender the property was no evidence for a jury, whatever it might be in the mind of the world at large. "And what am I to do?" asked Mason. "Take the goods the gods provide you," said the attorney. "Accept the offer which your half-brother has very generously made you." "Generously!" shouted Mason of Groby. "Well, on his part it is generous. It is quite within his power to keep it, and were he to do so, no one would say he was wrong. Why should he judge his mother?" Then Mr. Joseph Mason went to another attorney. But it was of no avail. The time was passing away, and he learned that Lady Mason and Lucius had actually started for Germany. In his agony for revenge he had endeavoured to obtain some legal order that should prevent her departure. "Ne exeat regno," as he repeated over and over again to his advisers learned in the law. But it was of no avail. Lady Mason had been tried and acquitted, and no judge would interfere. "We should soon have her back again, you know, if we had evidence of forgery," said the last attorney. "Then by God we will have her back again," said Mason. But the threat was vain, nor could he get any one even to promise him that she could be prosecuted and convicted; and by degrees the desire for vengeance slackened as the desire for gain resumed its sway. Many men have threatened to spend a property upon a lawsuit, who have afterwards felt grateful that their threats were made abortive; and so it was with Mr. Mason. After remaining in town over a month, he took the advice of the first of those new lawyers, and allowed that gentleman to put himself in communication with Mr. Furnival. The result was that by the end of 6 months he again came out of Yorkshire to take upon himself the duties and privileges of the owner of Orley Farm. And then came his great fight with Dockwrath, which in the end ruined the Hamworth attorney, and cost Mr. Mason more money than he ever liked to confess. Dockwrath claimed to be put in possession of Orley Farm at an exceedingly moderate rent, as to the terms of which he was prepared to prove that Mr. Mason had already entered into a contract with him. Mr. Mason utterly ignored such a contract, and contended that the words contained in a certain note produced by Dockwrath amounted only to a proposition to let him the land in the event of certain circumstances and results, which circumstances and results never took place. This lawsuit Mr. Joseph Mason did win, and Mr. Samuel Dockwrath was, as I have said, ruined. What the attorney did to make it necessary that he should leave Hamworth I do not know, but Miriam, his wife, is now the mistress of that lodging house to which her own mahogany furniture was so ruthlessly removed. End of Chapter 79 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. Chapter 80 of Orley Farm, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 80, showing how affairs settled themselves at Noningsby. We must now go back to Noningsby for one concluding chapter, and then our work will be completed. "You are not to go away from Noningsby when the trial is over, you know. Mamma said that I had better tell you so." It was thus that Madeline had spoken to Felix Graham as he was going out to the judge's carriage on the last morning of the celebrated Great Orley Farm case, and as she did so she twisted one of her little fingers into one of his buttonholes. This she did with a prettiness of familiarity, and the assumption of a right to give him orders and hold him to obedience, which was almost intoxicating in its sweetness. And why should she not be familiar with him? Why should she not hold him to obedience by his buttonhole? Was he not her own? Had she not chosen him and taken him up to the exclusion of all other such choosings and takings? "I shall not go till you send me," he said, putting up his hand as though to protect his coat, and just touching her fingers as he did so. "Mamma says it will be stupid for you in the mornings, but it will not be worse for you than for Augustus. He stays till after Easter." "And I shall stay till after Whitsuntide, unless I am turned out." "Oh, but you will be turned out. I am not going to make myself answerable for any improper amount of idleness. Papa says you have got all the law courts to reform." "There must be a double Hercules for such a set of stables as that," said Felix, and then with the slight ceremony to which I have before adverted, he took his leave for the day. "I suppose there will be no use in delaying it," said Lady Staveley on the same morning as she and her daughter sat together in the drawing room. They had already been talking over the new engagement by the hour together, but that is a subject on which mothers with marriageable daughters never grow tired, as all mothers and marriageable daughters know full well. "Oh, mamma, I think it must be delayed." "But why, my love? Mr. Graham has not said so." "You must call him Felix, mamma. I'm sure it's a nice name." "Very well, my dear, I will." "No, he has said nothing yet, but of course he means to wait till it will be prudent." "Men never care for prudence of that kind when they're really in love, and I'm sure he is." "Is he, mamma?" "He will marry on anything or nothing, and if you speak to him he tells you of how the young ravens were fed. But he always forgets that he's not a young raven himself." "Now you're only joking, mamma." "Indeed I'm quite in earnest. But I think your papa means to make up an income for you, only you must not expect to be rich." "I do not want to be rich. I never did." "I suppose you will live in London, and then you can come down here when the courts are up. I do hope he won't ever want to take a situation in the colonies." "Who, Felix? Why should he go to the colonies?" "They always do, the clever young barristers who marry before they have made their way."
"That would be very dreadful. I really think it would kill me." "Oh, mamma, he shan't go to any colony." "To be sure there are the county courts now, and they are better. I suppose you wouldn't like to live at Leeds or Merthyr Tydvil?" "Of course I shall live wherever he goes, but I don't know why you should send him to Merthyr Tydvil." "Those are the sort of places they do go to. There is young Mrs. Bright Newdegate. She had to go to South Shields, and her babies are all dreadfully delicate. She lost two, you know. I do think the Lord Chancellor ought to think about that. Reigate or Maidstone, or anywhere about Great Marlow would not be so bad." And in this way they discussed the coming event and the happy future, while Felix himself was listening to the judge's charge and thinking of his client's guilt. Then there were 2 or 3 days passed at Noningsby of almost unalloyed sweetness. It seemed that they had all agreed that prudence should go by the board, and that love, with sweet promises, and hopes bright as young trees in spring, should have it all her own way. Judge Staveley was a man who on such an occasion, knowing with whom he had to deal, could allow ordinary prudence to go by the board. There are men, and excellent men too, from whose minds the cares of life never banish themselves, who never seem to remember that provision is made for the young ravens. They toil and spin always, thinking sternly of the worst and rarely hoping for the best. They are ever making provision for rainy days, as though there were to be no more sunshine. So anxious are they for their children that they take no pleasure in them, and their fear is constant that the earth will cease to produce her fruits. Of such was not the judge. Dulce est desipere in locis, he would say, and let the opportunities be frequent and the occasions many. Such a love-making opportunity as this surely should be one. So Graham wandered about through the dry March winds with his future bride by his side, and never knew that the blasts came from the pernicious east, and she would lean on his arm as though he had been the friend of her earliest years, listening to and trusting him in all things. That little finger, as they stood together, would get up to his buttonhole, and her bright frank eyes would settle themselves on his, and then her hand would press closely upon his arm, and he knew that she was neither ashamed nor afraid of her love. Her love to her was the same as her religion. When it was once acknowledged by her to be a thing good and trustworthy, all the world might know it. Was it not a glory to her that he had chosen her, and why should she conceal her glory? Had it been that some richer, greater man had won her love, some one whose titles were known and high place in the world approved, it may well be that then she would have been less free with him. "Papa would like it best if you would give up your writing and think of nothing but the law," she said to him. In answer to which he told her with many compliments to the special fox in question, that story of the fox who had lost his tail, and thought it well that other foxes should dress themselves as he was dressed. "At any rate papa looks very well without his tail," said Madeline, with somewhat of a daughter's pride. "But you shall wear yours all the same if you like it," she added, with much of a young maiden's love. As they were thus walking near the house on the afternoon of the 3rd or 4th day after the trial, one of the maids came to them and told Madeline that a gentleman was in the house who wished to see her. "A gentleman!" said Madeline. "Mr. Orme, miss. My lady told me to ask you up if you were anywhere near." "I suppose I must go," said Madeline, from whom all her pretty freedom of manner and light happiness of face departed on the moment. She had told Felix everything as to poor Peregrine, in return for that story of his respecting Mary Snow. To her it seemed as though that had made things equal between them, for she was too generous to observe that though she had given nothing to her other lover, Felix had been engaged for many months to marry his other love. But girls, I think, have no objection to this. They do not desire first fruits, or even early fruits, as men do.
Indeed, I am not sure whether experience on the part of a gentleman in his use of his heart is not supposed by most young ladies to enhance the value of the article. Madeline was not in the least jealous of Mary Snow, but with great good nature promised to look after her and patronize her when she should have become Mrs. Albert Fitzallen. "But I don't think I should like that Mrs. Thomas," she said. "You would have mended the stockings for her all the same." "Oh yes, I would have done that, and so did Miss Snow. But I would have kept my box locked. She should never have seen my letters." It was now absolutely necessary that she should return to the house and say to Peregrine Orme what words of comfort might be possible for her. If she could have spoken simply with her heart, she would have said much that was friendly, even though it might not be comfortable. But it was necessary that she should express herself in words, and she felt that the task was very difficult. "Will you come in?" she said to Felix. "No, I think not. But he's a splendid fellow, and to me was a staunch friend. If I can catch him as he comes out, I will speak to him." And then Madeline, with hesitating steps, with her hat still on her head and her gloves on her hands, walked through the hall into the drawing room. There she found her mother seated on the sofa, and Peregrine Orme standing before her. Madeline walked up to him with extended hand and a kindly welcome, though she felt that the colour was high in her cheeks. Of course it would be impossible to come out from such an interview as this without having confessed her position, or hearing it confessed by her mother in her presence. That, however, had been already done, and Peregrine knew that the prize was gone. "How do you do, Miss Staveley?" said he. "As I am going to leave The Cleeve for a long time, I have come over to say good bye to Lady Staveley and to you." "Are you going away, Mr. Orme?" "Yes, I shall go abroad. To Central Africa, I think. It seems a wild sort of place, with plenty of animals to kill." "But isn't it very dangerous?" "No, I don't think so. The people always come back alive. I've a sort of idea that nothing will kill me. At any rate, I couldn't stay here." "Madeline, dear, I've told Mr. Orme that you have accepted Mr. Graham. With a friend such as he is, I know that you will not be anxious to keep this a secret." "No, mamma. I was sure of that, and now that your papa has consented to it, and that it is quite fixed, I am sure that it is better that he should know it. We shall always look upon him as a very dear friend, if he will allow us." Then it was necessary that Peregrine should speak, which he did as follows, holding Madeline's hand for the first 3 or 4 seconds of the time. "Miss Staveley, I will say this of myself, that if ever a fellow loved a girl truly, I loved you, and I do so now as well or better than ever. It is no good my pretending to be contented, and all that sort of thing. I am not contented, but very unhappy. I have never wished for but one thing in my life, and for that I would have given all that I have in the world. I know that I cannot have it, and that I am not fit to have it." "Oh, Mr. Orme, it is not that." "But it is that. I knew you before Graham did, and loved you quite as soon. I believe, though of course I don't mean to ask any questions, but I believe I told you so before he ever did." "Marriages, they say, are planned in heaven," said Lady Staveley. "Perhaps they are. I only wish this one had not been planned there. I cannot help it. I cannot express my satisfaction, though I will heartily wish for your happiness. I knew from the first how it would be, and was always sure that I was a fool to love you. I should have gone away when I first thought of it, for I used to feel that you never cared to speak to me." "Oh, indeed I did," said poor Madeline. "No, you did not. And why should you, when I had nothing to say for myself? I ought to have fallen in love with some foolish chit with as little wit about her as I have myself." "I hope you will fall in love with some very nice girl," said Lady Staveley, "and that we shall know her and love her very much." "Oh, I dare say I shall marry some day. I feel now as though I should like to break my neck, but I don't suppose I shall. Good bye, Lady Staveley."
"Good bye, Mr. Orme, and may God send that you may be happy."
"Good bye, Madeline. I shall never call you so again, except to myself. I do wish you may be happy. I do indeed. And as for him, he has been before me, and taken away all that I wanted to win." By this time the tears were in his eyes, and his voice was not free from their effect. Of this he was aware, and therefore, pressing her hand, he turned upon his heel and abruptly left the room. He had been unable to say that he wished also that Felix might be happy, but this omission was forgiven him by both the ladies. Poor Madeline, as he went, muttered a kind farewell, but her tears had mastered her also, so that she could hardly speak. He went directly to the stables, there got upon his horse, and then walked slowly down the avenue towards the gate. He had got the better of that tear-compelling softness as soon as he found himself beyond the presence of the girl he loved, and was now stern in his mood, striving to harden his heart. He had confessed himself a fool in comparison with Felix Graham, but yet, he asked himself, in spite of that, was it not possible that he would have made her a better husband than the other? It was not to his title or his estate that he trusted, as he so thought, but to a feeling that he was more akin to her in circumstances, in ways of life, and in tenderness of heart. As all this was passing through his mind, Felix Graham presented himself to him in the road. "Orme," said he, "I heard that you were in the house, and have come to shake hands with you. I suppose you have heard what has taken place. Will you not shake hands with me?" "No," said Peregrine, "I will not." "I am sorry for that, for we were good friends, and I owe you much for your kindness. It was a fair stand-up fight, and you should not be angry." "I am angry, and I don't want your friendship. Go and tell her that I say so, if you like." "No, I will not do that." "I wish with all my heart that we had both killed ourselves at that bank." "For shame, Orme, for shame." "Very well, sir, let it be for shame." And then he passed on, meaning to go through the gate, and leaving Graham on the grass by the roadside. But before he had gone 100 yards down the road, his better feeling came back upon him, and he returned. "I am unhappy," he said, "and sore at heart. You must not mind what words I spoke just now." "No, no, I am sure you did not mean them," said Felix, putting his hand on the horse's mane. "I did mean them then, but I do not mean them now. I won't say anything about wishes. Of course you will be happy with her. Anybody would be happy with her. I suppose you won't die and give a fellow another chance." "Not if I can help it," said Graham. "Well, if you are to live, I don't wish you any evil. I do wish you hadn't come to Noningsby, that's all. Good bye to you." And he held out his hand, which Graham took. "We shall be good friends yet, for all that is come and gone," said Graham. And then there were no more words between them. Peregrine did as he said, and went abroad, extending his travels to many wild countries, in which, as he used to say, any one else would have been in danger. No danger ever came to him, so at least he frequently wrote word to his mother. Gorillas he slew by scores, lions by hundreds, and elephants sufficient for an ivory palace. The skins and bones and other trophies he sent home in various ships, and when he appeared in London as a lion no man doubted his word. But then he did not write a book, nor even give lectures, nor did he presume to know much about the huge brutes he had slain, except that they were pervious to powder and ball. Sir Peregrine had endeavoured to keep him at home by giving up the property into his hands, but neither for grandfather nor for mother, nor for lands and money, would he remain in the neighbourhood of Noningsby. "No, mother," he said, "it will be better for me to be away." And away he went. The old baronet lived to see him return, though with plaintive wail he often declared to his daughter-in-law that this was impossible. He lived, but he never returned to that living life which had been his before he had taken up the battle for Lady Mason. He would sometimes allow Mrs. Orme to drive him about the grounds, but otherwise he remained in the house, sitting solitary over his fire, with a book indeed open before him, but rarely reading. He was waiting patiently, as he said, till death should come to him. Mrs. Orme kept her promise, and wrote constantly to Lady Mason, hearing from her as constantly. When Lucius had been 6 months in Germany, he decided on going to Australia, leaving his mother for the present in the little German town in which they were staying. For her, on the whole, the change was for the better. As to his success in a thriving colony, there can be but little doubt. Felix Graham was soon married to Madeline, and as yet I have not heard of any banishment either to Patagonia or to Merthyr Tydvil. And now I may say farewell. End of chapter 80, and also end of the book Orley Farm by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.